Not at the actual place it's happening. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to minimize you now and then we'll get started.
Welcome to Kent State University at ASHTABULA, the best campus in the Kent State system. I recognize some of you as students, former students. We have some people who are here today. It's the first time they've been on the campus, so we'd like to welcome you to our beautiful campus. A few days ago, it was a whiteout. We were getting snow, so I'm glad the weather's at least a little sunnier today. If not, I wish it was warmer, but change the weather. This colloquium really started out with the brainchild of Ed and Carol Murray. They were members of our community and members of our faculty for a number of years. And when they retired a few years ago, we made the commitment that we would carry it on. And so I'm really appreciative that Dr. Castellani kind of took the reins and planned the seminar today. So Brian has been here. It seems like we've been here together for a long time, and Brian reminded me this morning that he's been here since 2002. So he's been a leader on the faculty, in the campus, and among the faculty. Had been chair of our faculty council, and has really been engaged with his department on the Kent campus as well. He's a full professor, and his students adore him.
Yes.
Right, guys?
I wasn't hearing anything.
So I'll look forward to meeting those of you I don't know throughout the day. So again, welcome, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Castellani.
Thank you, Sue. And I just want to, as far as the topic for today, Sue will be on the panel later, but I couldn't think of a better person to exemplify what we're trying to discuss today, which is this issue of regional complexity. And Carl Dister came up with the great title, Advocating, Creating, and Transforming Change Across the Nexus. When I was putting this together, people were asking me sort of, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish here? And I said, I don't really know. So part of today really is about a sort of an experiment. I don't want, and Sue sort of, as we sat down and discussed this, and Carl and I, we didn't want to just do an academic exercise. We wanted to do something that had its goal as actually making change, or at least beginning to strategize about how change would take place. And when we were looking for a theme, every time we would say, well, what should we be talking about? And someone would go, the opioid crisis. And we'd say, well, what should we talk about? The opioid crisis. And then it was very serious. We had a newspaper article that was written on this event. And I received a phone call from a woman in the area, and she said, will there be continuing education credits for the day? And I said, unfortunately, no. And then she emailed me back and said, my daughter overdosed and died at 18. And suddenly the academic dimension of today just disappeared. It was like a stomach punch. And I said, I'm, obviously tremendously sorry to hear that. And it was, I think, her way of saying, I just want to let you know this is very serious, it's very real. And I think, that's sort of the focus that we want to take today, that these problems are very real, and I'm very excited about the diversity of people in this room. And we have auditors, lawyers, people from grid reliability, mental health, addiction, education, just about everything, domestic violence, human trafficking. We've got nursing, medicine, yes, we have physicians in the room, computational scientists, engineers. We've got a lot of different people in the room, students to senior faculty, on purpose to see what we can do, what can happen. So I first want to give a very big thank you to Sue and the group, Mary and Kathy, and the computer services, Mike and Kevin. And this is a campus event, and I'm very happy that everybody helped out and without question. And also I want to thank, as far as our funding goes, the Division of Research and Sponsored Programs, Regional College, Sociology, and then in COSI, which was also exciting to me because it was a way of showing the university, which is what's a huge concern, is are we linking with the community? Are we making partnerships? Sue had a meeting the other day for us, and I think, what is it, $60 million is the impact we've had in the region. So, we do have a goal in mind, and it is to make an impact, and I think that's one of the things that I've enjoyed most about being on this campus. As far as our esteemed colleagues for our panel, so what we'll do is, I'm going to do this brief introduction, then my good friend and colleague David Byrne is in the UK. He's a emeritus professor at Durham University. I could not unfortunately make it, but being David, and he can hear us. Can you hear us, David?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. He is Skyping in. So we are going to get a wonderful presentation from him about the crisis of the liberal state, where we're at right now in sort of Western society as metropolitan regions and a larger society, and how that crisis links to regional complexity and what we in the field call wicked problems. From there, we'll go to a study that Carl has been doing with a number of citizen scientists, some of whom are in the room, on how is that regional complexity actually impacting people in the different arenas that they're working in. And then we'll go to the panel, which will then begin to discuss how would you actually advocate or move change across. Then for those invited to the second half, we'll go do lunch, And we're going to use the open space format, as a lot of you have seen from emails that I've been sending along, to try to come up with some creative ways of advocating for change. So, as I said, opioid epidemic is our central theme, but it's not the only theme. That's one of the things that's going to be very important today. Don't feel like we have to talk about the opioid crisis. For example, one of the big impacts that's been in this area is foster care. As a result of the opioid epidemic, we have an escalating number of kids who are now orphaned or in need of foster care. Then it connects to homelessness. It connects to economic deprivation in the community. It affects fuel poverty. So it links across, and so I really want to push us to think wide. Goes to this issue then of complexity. When people say to me, aren't the social sciences just inherently complex? Yes, but there is a field that's emerged to say we need to study complexity explicit, and in very explicit ways, and that's the field that a number of my colleagues that are here today, that I'll introduce later for the panel, take as an active focus in their research. And as far as thinking about complexity and why regional, roughly 54% of the world today presently live in metropolitan areas. I'll show you this map here as an example. Let's just sort of push through this. This was a map that was in the New York Times that said even the concept of states in the United States is outdated in many ways. This is re-looking at the map in the United States in terms of metropolitan regions, and I'm sure those from grid reliability would resonate in terms of how our power structures, how's the entire infrastructure of our society located. And Carl and I often talk about how do you think about Northeastern Ohio in terms of its borders, the mountain regions, the rivers, the water, the watershed, the ecology going on, and then how does that connect to the economy and transportation and so forth. So this is the world we're living in now, and the question then is, well, for our particular quadrant here, what's taking place? And definitely literature shows as things like Cleveland start to come back, as Chicago grows and Pittsburgh, these metropolitan regions, rural areas such as ASHTABULA are oftentimes negatively impacted. And Dave Prusik, our cultural anthropologist, we were talking a bit about this in terms of reconciliation with the community. How would you even start to heal a community like this? Yesterday we met with one of my good friends, Joe Wiley, a psychiatrist down in Akron, and he was talking about the profound impact, that negative impact that trauma early on has on later adult life. And then we went to this question, what about social trauma? You think about the discourse right now in the United States, it's not a very nice discourse, right? We're screaming at each other. And Petter has a colleague from Sweden, and Petter is from Sweden too, and Claus, and he said, we wouldn't even begin to talk to each other that way. So before you even get to gun violence and opioid addiction, you need to even look at how you just communicate with one another, right? And the trauma that comes from that way of discussing. So one of the focus groups that will be thrown out later, Kevin Basirno is going to talk, is how do we get to a place of better communication, particularly amongst us as professionals. As the opioid epidemic goes, the numbers are not nice. Well, roughly 116 people die every day from opiate-related drug overdoses. About 11.5 million misuse prescriptions. Roughly 2.1 million have had an opioid use disorder. And in terms of economic costs, around $504 billion. When we move on and look at, say, for example, prescription painkillers, you see the number one reason is to relieve physical pain. Petra will talk a bit later about sort of one of the reasons that shifted as far as the way prescribing behaviors in the United States went. And that's another reason for bringing in my international colleagues. I'm hoping today, through the discussion, that we'll do this comparative perspective. Obvious from University of Toronto, and bringing a Canadian perspective specializing in drug addiction treatment as a physician. How are things happening in Canada? How are things happening in France? How are things happening in the UK? And can we learn from these different lessons? So it's to really sort of think through the issue. And then, for example, if you look, ASHTABULA has been hit hard. This is the overdoses in Ohio. But I was amazed to see, for example, that Mahoning County is actually worse than our county is, which just sits right below us. And that's where Youngstown is as a city, for those not familiar with the area, heavily hit negatively by deindustrialization and struggling desperately to get together. One of the people we interviewed for the study, Megan had interviewed, was a woman who runs a domestic violence task force. She unfortunately couldn't be here. Her husband was ill, but she said, please, let everybody know everything that you've been talking about, the emails that I've been sending out to those of you getting, she said, it's very real here. It is a major issue. And then you see, I found this staggering, and Matt Butler is one of our local treatment facility people. He'll definitely have a lot more to say about this than I will. But roughly 37% of client admissions right now in Ohio into inpatient addiction treatment are for opiate-related issues. That also includes heroin. So the question is, how do we make sense of this regional complexity? How do we deal with it? And us as a group to participate in that discussion about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David. Just give us a second here, David. We're going to pull up your PowerPoint. Can you see us okay, David?
No, I can't see. No, I can't see you. I can hear you better. See me? See me?
How do we get him to see Mike?
The camera should be transmitting. It was plugged in.
Just give us 1 second.
I can see you, Brian. I see you,
So you
Brian.
can see me. Could turn this right around and just let him. All right. See me here.
This is the camera, so we're checking this way.
Maybe it's not working. How about we just turn him around?
Yeah, yes, we can. I don't know if it's possible.
All right, can you see everybody now, David?
Nope. Nope. Too much about fall out with the. I can hear you very well.
Great. All right, we'll just proceed then. Okay, so as I said, David is Professor Emeritus up at Durham University. David is extremely well known in the field of complexity science. He's written some of the most important books and some of the most important articles on the topic, specifically about transferring or translating complexity science into the study of social complexity. David is also very much focused on applied social science and sociology throughout his life, and has been an advocate for that position, as well as the development of methods, which a number of us here have worked to extend into various areas known as case comparative perspective. So as you can see, David's title today is From Industrial to Post-Industrial, a complexity take on the transformation of city regions. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Okay. Okay. Ryan, can you bring up the second slide?
Let's see here.
While Brian's doing that. My adult life, I'm 71 years old, which the world I
Can you hear us, David? Hold on a minute, because we're having technical difficulties.
Okay, try again, David, sorry.
Right, I was just going to say, my adult life, I'm 71, okay, has been one in which the world I was born into has changed completely. Because I was born into a world of industry, of industrial capitalism, and a welfare states have been established after the Second World War. It's true that welfare states were much more expensive in Europe than they were in the United States, but after the New Deal and the experience of the Second World War, had significant welfare components. Now, the second slide is just an illustrative slide to show you how much deindustrialization there has been. The United Kingdom, along with Germany, is a society it was most industrialized, particularly in terms of the proportion of workers who worked in industrial jobs. It's gone from 45% to 18. I haven't got the World Bank data doesn't give 1970 for the United States, but I bet it was in the high 30s at that point, if not 40. And the United States has industrialized a lot. If you move on to the next slide, Brian. Now, I'm going to use an example to illustrate. And this is Cleveland, but it's not your Cleveland, okay? It's Cleveland area in the northeast of England around the mouth of the River Tees. And I used to think Cleveland, Ohio was named for Cleveland, but it's not. It was named for Grover Cleveland. There's a coincidence in all sorts of ways. Heavy industry, steel, chemicals. Two of the very few places in the world where rivers have ever caught fire. The Cuyahoga and the Tees have both burst into flame on occasion, although the Tees is now very clean and full of salmon. And if you look at it, the other interesting thing is Middlesbrough, the town which I'm presenting to you data here, is no older than Cleveland, Ohio. It literally sprang from the ground in the 1840s because there was iron in the Cleveland Hills, and there was an enormous iron industry which developed, and then a chemical industry was added to it. And in the 1960s, the Teesside area was producing nearly 10% of the UK's gross domestic product. It was a real industrial powerhouse. You move on to the next slide, Brian. Right, now I'm having technical problems. Hang on. There we are. This is a slide which I think shows you things better than the table. The y-axis percentage of employment. And you will see that the industrial employment fell off a cliff in the 1890s. Now, what's interesting is that we've had a substitution of public sector employment for that industrial employment. The public sector is now the largest single. On to the next slide, can you, Brian? The idea I want to present to you is that we've gone through a second great, if partial, transformation. Many of you who are social scientists will know Pagliani's book, Great Transformation, which talks about how the kind of world we live in came into being at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. It's the development of the state and the creation of a society dominated by market relationships. But Pagliani perhaps paid too little attention to how much that was associated with the development of an industrial system and the creation of urban areas which were primarily locales in which people worked in industry rather than lived in agriculture. So I remember reading a comment by a New York realtor talking about cities in the 1980s, where he said cities are machines for making peasants into industrial workers. And there's a lot of truth in that. For example, most of my own family in the middle of the 19th century moved to the northeast of England from the west of Ireland, where they had been peasants and became industrial workers, mostly coal miners. What we've seen now is a transformation where we have a massive reduction in the proportion of people who work in industrial jobs and a somewhat less, but still very large drop in the proportion of gross domestic product in our kind of societies that is produced by industry. The world is still industrial, but the industrial world is in China, Southeast Asia, Pakistan, Mauritius, you name it. Right? Look at where your clothes are made. That's just a good clue. This is the second great partial transformation. It's a great transformation because things have changed so radically, but it's only partial because it still remains a market capitalist system. So I'm going to put up some relevant, if you put up the next slide, Ryan, really using some complexity terminology, contextualization. We're going to phase shift. Yeah? Complexity theory, phase shift is when the system changes into a radically different state while remaining a system collapsing. We've seen a transformation from quantity into quality. The radical, over a relatively short period of time, change in the composition of work really is shift of that kind. And we're in a time of crisis because I don't think really that things can go on as they are. The term crisis is a medical term. It originated in describing the course of an infectious disease before we have antibiotics, or perhaps given the crisis in antibiotic resistance after we have them, where a patient either got better because their immune system had overcome the infection, or died because the infection overcame their immune system. It's a good term, and it's used a lot in social science. And the consequences of the crisis are expressed in the places in which people live. I think for us, the significant hierarchy is the region, and Brian's already raised the idea of city region. There's a very important emphasis in social and economic geography on a world which is composed not so much of nation states, but of city regions which are interconnected with each other in all sorts of different ways. And I think that's an important way of looking at things. The New York Times article Brian referenced is a very good one on that topic. Then we have the localities, especially the municipalities or counties or local governance areas in which we live. And finally, we have neighborhoods, which are really where we live on a day-to-day basis. Now, we move in and out of our neighborhoods. We move around our localities. We even move around our regions sometimes for work. But the way we live in a particular residential zone matters a great deal. Deindustrialization is everywhere. It's in the great world cities like London and New York. When I was a graduate student in London in 1970, it was still an enormous industrial city with a whole set of major factories, docks, other things. That has completely gone. New York's another example. And one of the things I want to say to you is that in complex systems, everything affects everything. We might think that globalization, the changes which have been produced in part to a considerable degree, I always think, by the shipping container, which so massively reduced the cost of the transportation of finished goods, is the main driver. And of course, it is a massive driver. The export of production. There's a firm in the UK called Coates and Patton, which used to be located in the Scottish town of Paisley. It pinched designs from India in the 18th and 19th century, so Paisley patents emerged. Coates and Patton now produces almost all of its finished garments in southern India. Right? So we find shifts like this. Well, how it's expressed in particular places depends on the context. Social scientists among you may be familiar with the standard critical realist term that mechanism in interaction with context determines outcome. I've jumped over slides, Brian. Can you put up that one? You got that one? And you notice I brought into use here a symbol which isn't all that much used, but it's on your typewriter. I thought it deserved to get out and do for a living. And that's the ampersand, the symbol I'm very fond of. So instead of just saying mechanism plus context, I'm saying mechanism in interaction with context. And notice that the outcome is directional. Yeah? So subsystems, which matter in how globalization produces localization. And let me stop there, because that term localization, I think, is very important. It was originally used in marketing. I remember when I was 17 and I managed to get to Tangiers, which was something in those days, I was very taken with the fact that Coca-Cola bottles were labeled in Arabic. And I brought back a lot of Coca-Cola bottle tops as a souvenir. That was a very trivial example of localization. But what I mean is globalization is expressed in particular places in ways which characterize the context of those places. So that's in interaction with what is already there. And subsystems which matter enormously are local policy regimes, especially regimes around taxation and subsidies. I noted when I came to Cleveland some 10 years ago that there was a radical difference in the United States in the tax base of municipalities and counties. They were very heavily dependent on property taxes, whereas in the United Kingdom and much of Europe, property taxes are less significant, and you have major elements of redistribution from general taxation. That was a issue in relation to education in Cleveland City, as I recall, because it had a weak property tax base, and that was enormously significant for its school system. Actually, the UK has moved in the same direction. Local authorities in the UK in the last few years have had massive reduction in the amount of money they receive from the central government and are much more dependent on local property taxation. But that matters. Local political systems matter in terms of what they prioritize, what they're oriented to. Some degree of ideological colour, but often I think it's as much a technical matter of how they envisage their futures. And local cultural systems, which is where I think we come into the idea of the O-point crisis. Because local cultural systems are particularly important in relation to behavioural responses at an individual level. And I think this is entirely new. In the 1930s, the time of the Great Depression, despite the fact that we had prohibition in the United States, we never had it in the UK, alcohol was a way out. Yeah? They used to say in Glasgow that the shortest way out of Glasgow was through the bottom of a glass. So we find people responding to changes in how they see their lives, particularly a notion of hopelessness in relation to their lives, in ways which reflect the fact that they have no secure position looking forward into the future. And nowhere in the old industrial states, I think, do people have a secure position looking forward into the future, particularly younger generations. Only the very, very affluent really feel secure in their lives. There's plenty of survey data to demonstrate that. Ryan, can you put up the next slide? This is the cover of a magazine in the UK, which is the closest equivalent to Scientific American. It's called New Scientist. And I noted just a few weeks ago, it actually asked if writing was on the wall for our sort of civilization. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that. There's the sustainability crisis. We're already, I think, on 1.5 Earths in terms of our use of resources because we are so dependent on fossil carbon. And fossil carbon is having positive feedbacks in terms of massive environmental change. It hasn't quite happened yet, but where I live, if the Gulf Stream gets shifted off, I'll be fighting polar bears in the street because it's as far north as some parts of Canada where polar bears are incredibly common. We'll have real issues. There is a crisis. But next slide, Brian. I'm going to say that policy matters. It's not that we can't do anything about these things, but what we do will have a determinant effect on how things play out. I've recently become very interested in taxation systems, together with my colleague Sally Ruana, wrote a book which follows on from Jim O'Connor's famous book of the 1970s, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, to try and look at how welfare capitalisms can afford to pay for what they are if they are now post-industrial, and in general, if big corporations and the super rich have managed to change the old mantra that the only two things in life that are certain are death and taxes, to for them that the only thing certain is death, at least as far as individuals are concerned. Because really, for super rich and big corporations, their ability to move their taxable liabilities to tax havens has meant that the tax bases of welfare capitalisms, post-industrial society, are very fragile. Reliance on property taxation, which is the local form of taxation, to fund local public services, has a positive feedback on deprivation, because the poorest areas have the least property tax. And that means that they have the worst quality of services, which means that deprivation becomes more intense. And we know how deprivation works out. I remember seeing this very, very much in terms of what people were telling me about the Cleveland City school system when I was here in your region before. And I think that applies at every level. In the UK, local government is experiencing an era of profound austerity. There are major cuts in public services. Our healthcare system, which is, your standards, extremely generous. The reason I'm not with you is because I have a minor infection effectively treated at no cost with antibiotics. But if it was to develop into anything, I went to the United States with my insurance switched off because I'm already getting treatment, then it would be another story. But even so, it's under tremendous pressure. And one of the biggest areas of pressure is in the whole domain of mental health, which of course includes addiction services. But there's a particular relationship, as we all know, between anxiety, depression, and addictive behaviors. We have to ask, is reindustrialization possible? As it happens, I think one of the most effective government agencies in the UK is the local economic partnership, which covers the Tees Valley area. It really does try to think about what's happening. But it's very, very difficult because you can't compete with low-income countries on cost. I had a PhD student who worked on tuberculosis in Bangladesh. And he was working on tuberculosis prevention, which is largely a matter of early treatment and quick diagnosis. Fortunately, Bangladesh does not have multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis, let alone total drug-resistant tuberculosis. But what was really interesting was to see that in Bangladesh, one of the areas in which there was the most transmission was in the garment industry, where there were 250,000 relatively well paid by Bangladeshi standards, often supporting whole families back in their villages, living in not too bad dormitory accommodation. But of course, if one of them got TB, the whole dorm was likely to be subject to infection. So we're looking at a different world. Actually, Bangladesh, in many ways, in terms of its TB incidence and prevalence and mortality rates, is not far removed from where the UK was in the 1950s, just after the antibiotic revolution. But that's another world. We can't compete with them on costs. Can we compete on labour productivity? In some areas, perhaps. But as the world changes, more and more areas become immensely productive. South Korea was a poor peasant society in the 1950s at the time of the Korean War. It is now a massively productive industrial system. And in fact, for example, some new technologies like single layer materials is ahead of anywhere else in the world. Do we need whole new forms of production? Those are questions we'll have to ask. Do we need to reimagine whole new ways of living? I know that there are people in Detroit who now are basically truck farming, market gardening in places that used to be residential city areas. Now let me go to my last slide, which is just one to throw at you. Can you put up the black elephant slide? You got that up, Brian? Right. Okay. Well, you don't really need this slide. It's just a quotation. Okay. It's from Peter Ho, who was the former chief civil servant in Singapore. Singapore is a very interesting place. It is a city-state, an immensely prosperous and productive city-state, but which is moving itself into a post-industrial condition, and which has devoted an enormous amount of resources to trying to accommodate that by getting to the cutting edge of every possible technology, biotechnology, new electronic technologies, and other things. But Ho drew together two ideas. One is the old idea of the elephant in the room. We all know what the elephant in the room is. It's something we know is a problem, but everybody ignores it. And then he picked up the idea of the black swan. And the black swan is a term, I think it was originally due to the philosopher Karl Popper, who was pointing out that we can never absolutely prove any statement. We can say all swans are white, and then you go to Australia and see black swans swimming around. I've seen them swimming around in the Huon River near my brother's house. Okay? So the proposition works out, something you never expected, which contradicts everything you say. And he brought these two terms together to say that what we have is a black elephant. I'll read it out. The black elephant is a cross between a black swan and the elephant in the room. It's a problem that's actually visible to everyone, but no one wants to deal with it, and so they pretend it is not there. When it blows up as a problem, we all feign surprise and shock, behaving as if it was a black swan. And I think that's a really nifty idea, because I think so many public policies are of that, public policy problems are exactly of that kind. Brian has already in his introduction used the term wicked issues, which goes back to a seminal article of the early 1970s, quoted more than 16,000 times. We know that we have these wicked issues, but what we see in some ways are the symptoms of them. And from my mind, many of the problems that we have, in the UK we focus very heavily at the minute on obesity, although in some locales we have an opioid epidemic. Brian was telling me that in the post-industrial city of Hull in Yorkshire, there is an opioid epidemic, somewhat on the same scale as you're experiencing. These are symptoms of the character of the system, right? They are recursive, they have more powers in and of themselves. They cause all kinds of problems in every way. The health services are massively overburdened by obesity, which now is a problem of the poor. But they are also to do with other things within the system. So I think that complexity provides us with a way of thinking about these things. It provides us with a way of trying to connect them. I'm very pleased that complexity has become part of the vocabulary of policymakers. I don't think it has yet become part of the vocabulary making of politicians. It's there with the professional civil servants. It's there with people who have to cope with things as they go on and have to have a longer time frame than elected politicians themselves. And I think that's one of the big problems we're facing. Now, I'm very sorry I'm not there with you, because I've been to your region before, liked it immensely, and was prevented at the last minute by the most trivial of things, but there you go. And that's what I have to say to you. Okay? Right, Brian?
So yesterday, what I did with, for the international colleagues that are here, I rented a van, got in the van, we went through Amish country, we drove down through rural southern Ohio, went over through Akron, came up through Akron up to I met with Joe Barley, psychiatrist, at St. Thomas, then went to the airport, then went through Cleveland, and then came back in the evening, and Kevin Esterno took us on a tour of the ASHTABULA region. And as we began to have a dialogue, I mean, we've got a variety of countries represented: France, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK. Francis spends a lot of time in the Republic of South Africa. And what we started to see, David, relative to your point about the black elephant concept, is everybody just kept saying two things. These differences certainly exist, but we're seeing the same phenomenon all around Western society. It may manifest itself differently in Normandy or in Scotland or in the Netherlands, but it is nonetheless these similar issues, this crisis. And so the question is, how do we get through it? And David, do you sort of have a sense of the value of an international perspective or global communication? Because we talk about regional communication, but even perhaps communicating at an international level.
I first, can you hear me?
Yes.
I came to Cleveland because I have had this long-standing project of looking at post-industrial city regions. Now that's a funky term. Places that used to be industrial and are increasingly not. And the places I looked at, I came to Cleveland, the same name as Cleveland in the northeast of England, so I thought that was nifty. But they're very, very simple. I looked at Rotterdam, which is the largest port in the whole of Europe, immensely successful port, but the numbers of people employed in it are tiny in comparison with its history. Yeah? So Rotterdam is a post-industrial city region. That's where I'm Lasse Garrett's our colleague from. Right? I looked at the Katowice region in the south of Poland, which is another industrial region dating from the middle of the 19th century. That area used to be part of Prussia, but now it's part of Poland. And if you look at Poland, Poland industrialized massively, although that region always had been, and it's experiencing exactly the same problems. And what's really interesting is I earned my living for the last 4 years I was teaching, largely teaching Chinese students. And I had Chinese students who came from the old industrial regions of China, particularly in Manchuria, who said that it's happening there as well. China is now losing a lot of industrial jobs, lower wage economies in places like Vietnam. So it is global. You look at it in Australia, you see it in Melbourne, you see it everywhere. And I don't, this is the black elephant, I don't think the political systems are recognizing that this is what they have to deal with. And that operates at every level of the political system. It's interesting, the local economic partnership referred to, which is a collaboration between local industry and local government in the Tees Valley area, does seem to have some sort of sense of this because it's separated from the electoral cycle. Yeah? And I'm very happy that these things are not being run by democratically elected governments. But I think that the problem is that politicians in these societies do not present these and say just how serious they are. And they have very, very few solutions for it.
Anybody else questions? Go ahead, Tim.
Hi, David. This is Tim Gallagher from Reliability First. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I did.
Very interesting. Thank you. In listening to what you said about deindustrialization, I wonder, that's a natural evolution of society, and I wonder if we could go back in time and look at the inflection point between an agricultural-based society and socioeconomic system to a more industrialized one, where the same societal problems were encountered then, maybe at a different scope, but maybe in a different tone. But I wonder if there's something we can learn about how we adapted to that globally and see if we can apply those lessons. Because I don't think we're going to stop what's happening with deindustrialization. Going backward is not going to happen.
I completely agree. Unless, there are elements of development of new technologies. For example, sustainable fuel systems are a valid sort of thing. But the past experience isn't very encouraging. What we did, well, as I said, my family originates in the far west of Ireland, in what were called the congested districts, right? The population of Ireland in 1841 was 8 million. Its population today is 4 million. There's no other country in the world which has that kind of experience. What happened? 1 million people died in a famine, but most people immigrated somewhere else, to the United States, to Australia, to Great Britain, to be taken up within the new industrial system. Now, it's true that one of the biggest changes is our demography. Pretty well everywhere in the world, population sizes are reducing very rapidly in terms of completed family size. But we have so many young people who still have a real geographic time bomb kicking off in places like North Africa or parts of East Asia. One of the most interesting things is Iran, by the way, because Iran has this very high level of female education, and its total fertility rate is dropping way down to European levels, but still it has enormous numbers of young people. How will these people be absorbed in the systems? One proposal, which is being advanced, taken up in some places, at least to limited degrees. I think there's been experiments in Canada and in Scotland that talk about this as well, is basically giving people a basic income and saying, just, you live on that. That's just enough to get by. But it is a bit like the decline of the Roman Empire and bread and circuses, and it doesn't look like a very happy situation. I think we have to have a very radical rethink about how we organize our lives. We've done some of this, because of course, I'm old enough to remember most of my contemporaries started work at the age of 15. I was a real exception to time education in my 20s. Now, I know the United States, this was earlier, most of Europe, nearly half of the age cohort is not as starting any kind of work until they're about 21 or 22. However, the other end of the system, crises in our pension systems, means that people are working until they're a lot older. You're right to say it's a big problem.
Yeah, relative to that, I think that links then, because ASHTABULA is an example of that. So in the previous switch, right from, as Dave can get up and lecture like that about, is moving from agricultural to industry. What did people do? They migrated, right? Where the jobs are, which is the reason that metropolitan notion of how things are organized, and that's what's happening in ASHTABULA. I systematically ask students every semester, how many of you upon getting a job are staying here? And no hands go up, right? They're going elsewhere. So then you see a community ravaged by that. We struggle, as our president of the university just came up with, enrollment. How do we keep this university going? How do we keep sustaining ourselves? And then when that out-migration of young people takes place, what follows in its wake? Addiction, domestic violence, right? All these sorts of things, human trafficking, all this sort of stuff comes in its wake. And I think, David, to your point, is when we were driving around yesterday, you know, for a number of my colleagues who haven't seen the Midwest yet, they said, are people not aware of it? It was so, and it was astonishing to me because I was looking at the area with new eyes. And I really saw, I was like, oh my God, we've been hit hard. You know, I mean, it's intellectually there, but to see it as you're showing somebody, you realize, so exactly what you're saying, David, so that's a very good point, Tim. Other questions relative to that or any comment? But it goes to an issue that I want to bring up to the panel later, and I'll throw out one last one, David, is so yesterday I met with Joe Varley, head of psychiatry down at Summit County, and we started off by saying to Joe, okay, and Francis is a physician, and we started talking about addiction, and so what do you think of this opiate thing? And David said, okay, fine. Joe said, fine. Yeah, prescription behaviors on the part of physicians. He goes, this is about social relationships. This is about reconciliation. This is about healing communities. This is not about physicians prescribing too many medications. Certainly that sets up, as Petra will talk later, sort of the perfect storm for it. But to be reminded, ASHTABULA was at one time the meth capital. Then ASHTABULA was the crack capital. Now opioid capital, right? So it's not, I think if we get so wrapped into the addiction itself and not why the addiction is taking place, we're missing it. And yet, when I went to the CDC to look at explanations for why the addiction, it went right to the individual. They're misusing it because of pain and stuff. The community was never discussed. So, go ahead.
David, Kevin Esterno, manager.
Can you hear Kevin okay, David?
Yeah, I can hear Kevin.
David, you have described and you've presented some fantastic points, and I think we all understand in this room the level of severity to these problems. Can you tell us, in your research and in your travels, what type of, give me something positive. I don't want to start crying.
That's for the second half of the day. I want to get you depressed enough that you get passionate enough.
Have you seen, can you tell me just one thing so I don't get in trouble from Brian?
Well,
this afternoon? Can you give me
I'll tell you one thing, which is local social enterprises. Yeah? Now, there's a lot of claims made, but some of them are very good indeed. It's not that there is work to be done in the world, but it's work of a different kind. So, for example, this is true of China, by the way, is of North America or Europe. We have a rapidly aging population with high levels of care needs, many of whom are developing dementia. I've seen local social enterprises actually being able to pay a reasonable wage and provide local social care services. But the idea of the local social enterprise, which is a not-for-profit, okay, basically all work as cooperative to a very considerable degree. And it's interesting that if you look at the Mondragon system in Spain, which is sent a very, very successful workers' cooperative system in the Basque Country, established nearly 50 years ago by a Catholic priest, you will see the development of these kinds of enterprises. So I think that is one little shine of light in the darkness, if you like.
Thank you, David.
Francis.
Hi Dave, Francis
Hi, Francis.
here. Can you say a little bit more about the link between the way the taxation works and the political system? Because we started to talk about it here a little bit on our travels when we were looking around. But I just want to understand a bit more about that. Because that seems to me to be one of the things that really acts as a sort of a boundary for what can happen within the area. I mean, it sort of sets up something about the system that makes it difficult for the system to shift. Is what I'm hearing from you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think at the big picture level, there's a real crisis on the ability of post-industrial welfare capitalism to raise the tax they need to fund the services which they promise. But this becomes particularly acute at the local level. I mean, both you and I, Francis, are UK residents, and we both know that while in principle, although not really in practice, the National Health Service has had its services protected in financial terms. Local government, which delivers, among other things, public health and a whole variety of social care services, has experienced enormous austerity. And a shift towards property taxation, which is the one thing which is easiest in some ways to tax, because the property is there and if you fix your property taxation. But it means you can only tax the property you have in your locality. And if you're a deprived area, you don't get very much. Now this came up in the UK in the interwar years. And some local councillors in London actually went to jail by setting illegal budgets, demanding redistribution from affluent areas of London to poor areas of London, basically from the West End to the East End. And they succeeded. They succeeded in having formula. But I mean, I think it's particularly difficult when the revenue base of a locality is being so severely eroded for it to be able to fund the services which it needs to deliver. And I think that's going to be an increasing problem. It's developing in the UK. I know that it's a big problem.
David, may I follow up? My name is David Perusek. I'm an anthropologist on the campus here. And I'm sure you're aware that in Ohio, as in much of the U.S., the school systems, public school systems, are funded on property taxes.
Yes.
And therefore, education becomes arguably the single greatest bastion of inequality in the United States, the most unequal of all the developed countries on earth. It not only reflects inequality, but it mass produces inequality. So that in deindustrialized towns, I'm from a small city known as Lorain, Ohio, and I grew up there in the heyday of the American working class. The steel mill there employed 15,000 people. My father and both grandfathers worked there, each of them for 40 years. There was an auto manufacturing plant, Ford Motor Company, that employed 10,000 people. American shipbuilding, George Steinbrenner made much of his fortune there. At one point, 70-some% of the freighters on the Great Lakes were manufactured there. I could keep going. The point is, all of that is gone, and the tax burden has now shifted from U.S. Steel and American shipbuilding, etc., and Ford Motor Company, onto the backs of the only people who in this town own anything. The town has become mostly a slum, and who owns things? Widows on fixed incomes who own their small houses. My mother, who recently died, was still in the house that she and my father bought in 1957, and we're going to be very lucky if we're able to get $3,000 or $4,000 more for that house than my parents paid for it in 1957. So when the tax burden goes from U.S. Steel to senior citizens on fixed income, you can fill in all of the blanks. And so school levies don't get funded, Even the nicest city parks have high grass in them in the summertime, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the picture from, this end, as you're well aware. And then, of course, the exploitation of workers the world over, where the jobs have gone, is the other side of that coin. But education, there are schools in the United States where buckets are kept throughout the aisles to catch the dripping rainwater. In contrast then to affluent communities with a big tax base, where they have the best of facilities and the best of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'm getting carried away here, but the point is that one of the single greatest bastions of inequality, both in reflecting what is and reproducing what is education in the United States.
Couldn't agree more. It's not anything like Pakistan in the UK. There's much less inequality because of national redistribution systems among school systems, right? But it is noticeable that the poorer local authorities are squeezing all aspects of their provision. I don't think, one thing which correct me if this is wrong, but one of the reasons why Cleveland has such a weak tax base is that two of its largest activities, the Cleveland Clinic and the healthcare systems associated with Case Western Reserve University, as charities don't pay local property taxes. I was told that when I was in Cleveland 10 years ago. Yeah? So I think that this of who do you tax and how do you reduce revenue is very important. Taxes have been shifted across the Western world to property taxes, which have exactly the impact you described, but also, of course, to consumption taxes, which are highly repressive and bear more heavily on poorer people. So this tax, which I'm currently obsessed with, really does not. But I think you're dead right. I've seen the literature on educational inequalities in the United States, and by Western European standards, or by published standards, in what is one of the most successful of the accession states to the EU, it looks bloody dreadful.
And that's again, thinking about this, if you're sort of thinking, okay, so opioid crisis, I mean, that's a good example that David's bringing up and you're addressing, because one of the goals of, or the goal of our dean and why we're here is to try to somewhat, partially assuage that problem. So there's where the Nexus connects, in terms of like, what do we do, that both Tim and Kevin raised, is the quality of the education, the type of education you're doing, and what degrees are we working on. Marna Drum does a lot with our criminal justice program, and degrees that are going to lead to actual employment, and trying to sort of think through that. But it requires universities to innovate, and it means academia needs to change as well, to move from this more traditional paradigm to really thinking about how do we better serve the community. So, any last question? We'll go with Joan over here and then go back. Yes.
You said something and I missed it because I was trying to put ideas together. You said something like local systems impact the behavior of individuals. Did you say
Exactly.
that? Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I got that right.
Okay.
Because I like that. It got me thinking.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier, that ASHTABULA has had some other crises with meth and the crack cocaine epidemic, but it's always gone back to the individual. So I guess what is being done, or has something been done to do kind of actionable lessons learned on these other crises that have already hit, so then you can further move with actionable, informed lessons to kind of mediate what's going on here, like widespread analysis of, unemployment and what happened after these epidemics or these crises, these kind of die down and residual effects. So kind of set yourself up for bigger talks on a community level.
No, it's an excellent question, and I'm going to throw it at Matt, so Matt knows that you knew it was coming. But I will say, so my training and background is in clinical psychology. So I worked for 10 years in healthcare, mostly in addiction. And my knee-jerk reaction is nothing was learned. And it's one of the reasons I went back and got a PhD in sociology. for me, sociology was not an academic exercise. I went back because the providers, and I don't know, you might have some opinions too, obvious, the providers have no knowledge of the fact that the patients they care for exist in systems. And I'll give you a very concrete example. I had a patient who was to be discharged on Monday from the Veterans Administration Addiction Recovery Center. The physician demanded that this person remain in treatment until Monday, where they would be leaving against physician's orders. The man kept saying, if I'm not at my job on Monday, I lose my job. At which point the physician said, what's more important, your job or your sobriety? And I said, I need to quit. I need to go back and relearn what's going on. Because this should not be, it made no sense in my mind. The patient left, didn't have the reinforcement of the treatment staff saying, good job, you've done well. And 6 months later, he relapsed. I don't want to, if you want to throw in anything, Matt? I know you're going to come here.
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question.
I think certainly these things are cyclic. I think certainly, I was going to say on the panel, but I'll say now, this is what's in all of our attention now, but there's going to be something else. This is a relatively recent problem. We are still the meth king. We have more meth lab seizures, raw meth lab seizures in Ashtabula County than anywhere in Ohio. That isn't per capita, that's actual small pot meth labs. It's just that meth isn't killing people in the same way that opioids are. So I think as a system, as a behavioral health system, we are doing a much better job of looking systemically and coordinating message-wise, coordinating, looking at things like employment, looking at things like housing, looking at other recovery supports than we've ever done, and trying to be a lot less siloed in terms of by agency or by industry or profession. Is anyone looking globally, systemically at these trends? I would say the best work that's being done in that area is through the local prevention coalition. We have a Drug-Free Communities grant, a federal grant. It's a 5-year cycle. So we're entering year 4 of that and have to do a lot of those pieces and looking at logic models in order to try for a very competitive 5 through 10 year cycle. And so a lot of that work is being done now, but the work that the Prevention Coalition is doing is largely prevention oriented. It's not looking necessarily at historical trends as much as what it's looking like right now and what we can do moving forward to impact people upstream, right? Because all your prevention work is going to really impact people 5 to 10 years from now. It's not going to impact people tomorrow necessarily. You're embedding this prevention message, and since you can't prove a negative, the work you do prevention-wise is kind of thrown out in the void, and you just hope that it has an impact downstream. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
we need scientists doing that stuff here locally, though.
And that's where I think, again, the Nexus, because there's so much we do in sociology that could aid that viewpoint. We have 3 more minutes before we go to Carl. Ali, would you want to throw anything on that from a Canadian perspective?
Well, I mean, I think what we struggle with in the healthcare system is and I would say this is definitely in Canada as well as the U.S., a disconnect between clinical medicine and public health.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, yes.
The clinical approach is really focused on the individual patient, and that's our responsibility as clinicians. But we are in a way sort of guardians of the health of the population in general, but are not necessarily trained how to do that. We have a separate system of sort of public health, which is supposed to deliver that kind of perspective, but there's a big disconnect between how clinical issues are addressed from a population health perspective, and resolving that, like the opioid crisis is a perfect example of how that needs to be resolved.
And that could be very well something for you to do, because that is, you said it so well, the difference between the public health model and the clinical model, and the absolute disconnect between them. Francis and then Tim, we've got 1 more minute, kiddo.
Is Dave still there?
Yes, you still there, David?
Yes, I'm here. Turn off the camera so you don't have to look at me anymore.
Suddenly got a little bit younger. I want to say something which I think I learned from David many years ago. And one of the things that I think we do in healthcare is we keep people alive and surviving while whatever the crisis is happening. And I think we have to be realistic about this. This might be their own individual crisis, or it might be the crisis that Dave is talking about here. What we do in healthcare, I think, is really important because it keeps the people alive and going. But we mustn't forget that other people probably, need to be changing other things to change the situation in which people are living.
And that would be a good example, like having Narcan in hand, right? So that anybody that overdoses can immediately take Narcan, right? Is that what? What is it?
Naloxone.
Thank you. Yeah. So but at the same, so that keeps them alive. But then there's this larger issue. Tim, did you want to throw anything in?
Yeah, just again, one of the reasons I'm excited to be here. I think all of us do different work, but all of us have the same issues we're trying to deal with. And thinking about the tax issue, I think we have to be careful to make sure we're treating disease and not symptoms. So in the example of the steel mills, I often ask, why did the steel mills go away? And if you go back in history, there were social policy issues, economic policy issues, environmental policy issues, all done in a discrete, isolated way, an uncoordinated fashion. Each of them intrinsically at the time looked very good, but when you put them all together, what you end up with is a problem in the future. So I just encourage us, in the course of our work and the rest of today, to try to think on a systems basis and think at a higher level. Because if we're not paying attention to the policy decisions that are made, just like in the opioid crisis, when you want to focus on the doctor or the individual, you're not looking at who created this problem, which is all of us, and who it impacts, which is all of us.
Yep.
So that's why I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, that's very well said. Well, thank you very much, David.
Been a pleasure. Wish I was there.
Yes. Well, another time. Okay, cheers. We'll see you. Okay, so next up is Carl. So I've had the great pleasure of working with Carl, and I mean that seriously. Carl is, in my mind, one of the more creative individuals that I've come across, in the sense that he has a wonderful capacity to think across the nexus and to actually consider things. For me, we all pride ourselves on thinking that we can think wider than we do. Carl showed me the blinders that I have as an academic, and that I tend to just stop short of doing something, right? I teach, so I can say, oh, there's where I make a difference. But and especially having somebody coming from a clinical background, I should know better. But those are my blinders, for example, Tim, where I just focus on my silo, publishing research, doing this, and then it's just out there, and I figure, well, somebody will use it. And Carl has consistently challenged me to say, well, so how does that actually, where does it go? Oh, I turn it over to the physicians. Well, then what do they do? To really think about how do you do this? And so I think Carl has a great mind, and I've really enjoyed over the past couple of years sort of working with him and getting to know him. And I know he is losing it because he does not like these types of compliments. I'm going to stop before he runs. I'll turn it over to you. Are we still okay, though? We're still okay. Oh, hello, everybody.
I don't like those kind of things.
Yeah.
I just wanted to report out on the study we're doing. If you don't mind, the people who were participating in the citizen science work who's here, could you raise your hand to let you know this is what we're reporting on? So, yeah, thank you for everyone here. Some of the people couldn't be here, but I'll try to represent. How many have read this book, The Defiance of Global Commitment? It's a good book. It's really outstanding. I'm not trying to put a sales pitch in for you, but in the book, Brian really did a nice, concise outline of some of these issues that David was talking about earlier. He talks about 10 high-level social systems up at the top, and he takes it right down to Freudian psychology but not old school Freudian psychology where everything you blame on your mom or whatever, like that. He rethought through Freud and said, here's what was really excellent about Freud's mental model, you know, the human mind, how it works, and then he makes the connection in the book. So, like Brian says, I challenge, well, if this book is true, let's test it out and see. Can we make a connection if we sample? I'm thinking like an engineer, if we sample these systems up here, would we see at the root cause some of these human issues, and what would that look like? So we put together this study. I'm not going to read that, of course, but and I put the timeline. This was a year ago now, April 6th. We put together a proposal, and thanks to Brian being the principal lead on this, how could we study these phenomena? And I challenged Brian, and I said, you know, I just want to try and work on Northeast Ohio. That's where I'm from. This is my home. So could we focus, you know, just around here? So we did, and we wanted to go big and look at complexity science and nexus issues and social technical systems, things myself and some of the other citizen scientists want to learn about. And then at the end of the day, we came up with these, we said, how are we going to go talk to just local activists and nonprofit organizations and explain complexity science? So they go to a coffee shop for 5 hours and have these heady talks. So Brian and I really workshopped this. What are some simple questions we could get at complexity science? And these were the 8 questions we asked. So the citizen scientists went through the IRB approval process, got trained. Brian gave us instruction. Here we all are at Spaces. Not all of us, most of us here. Myself, I took the picture, and Megan is missing today, but in August we met, and Brian gave us training as a sociologist. How do we interview people? And how do we explain complexity without getting into it? And it was a fun day. We had a lot of good questions. I noticed a picture of Brian with the Batman mask here. It's one of our favorite shots. I gave Brian the mask as a facilitator of this event here, and I said, Brian, if you're going to say something professorial, put the mask on. But when you just want to talk like us, because none of us are sociologists, take the mask off. He didn't have to put the mask on at all. He just talked like a regular person to us and explained, you know, what was going on. Everyone appreciated it. And you had some tough cookies in here to deal with. Lawyers. That's what I really enjoy learning from Ryan, is that he drops the facade and is able to just communicate. Because honestly, we were all there because we were concerned about Northeast Ohio, Brian included. It wasn't an academic thing. Yeah, we wanted to learn about social science, but that's what we did. So we drew this map of Northeast Ohio, and we based it on the watershed. We wanted to get down to the soil, and not just artificial boundaries by counties or something. And this is a very popular ecosystem here. Even back for the first peoples who lived here, this is a crucial navigation port to fresh water, a lot of good growing areas, and we thought there's our boundary, where people actually live close to the land. And then we took Brian's map of the 10 systems. Sylvia Walby, is that who came up with these? And this in itself, studying these 10 systems was fun. How do sociologists and social scientists look at society? This is different than like Tim and I are, and Larry back here, all of us are thinking DHS sectors, you know, we got transportation, and this is a whole different set. And the blue bars there are where we sampled. We wanted to sample as many of these 10 subsystems and a good sampling around Northeast Ohio, so we picked nonprofits. We had a big list, and we called them all, and these were the ones who we interviewed. That was back in August. Went through this. This is really fun training. No one cheated the system, right? They all went through this. But they had ideas of how to cheat the system. Then for 5 months until January, we interviewed. It takes a long time for us citizen scientists just to find time. People going on Saturdays. Brian's in the room. You're one of the interviewers. Besh is here. We were just when you can get together with people, and we're working. So, you know, it's not easy to get together during the day. And then we came back together with Brian in different meeting spaces. Even went to dinner once. That was fun. But there's the citizen scientists all trying to see what themes emerged. And Brian led us through this theme to try and get at what was common among all these nonprofits. It was really difficult for us, none of us being social scientists or psychologists, just a dad who's an engineer, and many of the scientists, Brian and Besh are here. It's really difficult for us to interview these nonprofits. We deal with technology all the time and math, and to hear these problems was really difficult to listen to for us. I think pretty much all of us were just saying, wow, this is just heart-wrenching, you know? And all of us being kind of techie, wanting to help and do something, and yet we're hearing these really difficult stories coming out. Anyhow, here's the themes that emerged. After we did all the interviews, reviewed the transcripts, Brian helped group them into categories so they're not so overwhelming. But we all agreed this first category is all about communities, identity, social justice. Reconciliation is probably one of the top. When Brian Hallett, I think, brought that out as a theme he saw, almost all of us in the room just resonated. All these nonprofits we talked to, whether it was opioid addiction or human trafficking, whatever the issue was, they all said these people need to be reconciled with the community. It reminded me of what you said, Ravi, of this. It's not just the patient, it's the whole community. And how do you get reconciliation when they don't reconcile with their neighbors and neighborhoods? It's real hard to go through the long process of recovery. So that was a great theme. And education, and they don't mean by that so much just, it is just classic education, but also just how to think about these complex issues. All the nonprofits said we don't know how to think about it as a system or what tools we look at. We're just in our silos doing our day-to-day job. And then communities and empowerment. They know they can't get funding all the time, shoestring budget, and how do you get communities involved and empowered? So those were the themes that emerged from that category. Data itself, all these nonprofits had a feeling like they could do better with data, analyzing data, open source data or confidential data, but they just don't have the skill set, and they don't know how to get access to the data. And even if they had the data and had access to it, how do they visualize it? What tools do they use? Meanwhile, they're working like 90 hours a week seeing people coming into recovery centers. So having data scientists that could help would be a big improvement. This issue about politics, power, sustaining change, there's no infrastructure for these they're all working, and including us, a nonprofit Tim mentioned before, we're trying to secure the grid. We do it a large part of the nation. But even in Northeast Ohio, there's no infrastructure for us to connect to these other nonprofits to help one another. It's real difficult. It's not like other systems where you could connect. And sustaining change, since they're all siloed and disconnected, all of a sudden opioid addiction is the problem of the day, and funding goes over here. Meanwhile, no one cares about grid reliability, or no one cares about human trafficking, so that funding's down. And there's no way to share that amongst the nonprofits locally. It's just feast or famine, and so it really seemed like Northeast Ohio could use something that is a little more, has a little more inertia in it over the time. This theme was about organizations. That first one, no one mentioned money. It wasn't so much that that we talked to were complaining, we don't have any money, and if we just had, $1 million more, we could solve this. It wasn't so much like that. It was, what do they do with it? Like, how do they plan this out to be successful? How do they do organizational development in order to figure out the best strategic way to spend the little resources they have? A lot of these nonprofits we talked to, they were started by a good, excited, passionate activist, and they don't have the skills of organizational strategy plan. They're just trying to work on issues, so they could really use some help in there. And then we talked about this, social justice is fashion. Which social problems do we address? Even if we work together as a community, all the nonprofits in Northeast Ohio, let's help one another. Then what? How would we share? how many people should Tim send to help out with the human trafficking issue in Northeast Ohio? And how many should an opioid recovery center send over to Tim to help with grid security? And no one's really helping balance that. There's just no mechanism. So everyone's just kind of working in their silo, doing their thing, pretty much. I love this chart. Finally, something technical. Yay. All that emotional stuff. I know this, I'm not going to read all this, but that chart I showed from Brian's book where he goes from the top layers down. These are those 10 systems up at the top, 10 societal systems. And then here's the 9 samples that we took in Northeast Ohio. We tried to get every one, but specifically domestic violence, opioid, infrastructure, city politics, prison systems, religions, church, pastor, children issues, big brothers, big sisters, women rights issues. These are and sometimes we sampled a couple times. Here's the themes I just mentioned, grouped into these 5 bins. And then down here at the lowest level are these 5 underlying psychological barriers. If you have a different model yourself that you're comfortable using of the human mind, that's fine. You could put that down here. But for Brian's book, these are some of the base human instincts that drive human psychology. And then there's ways to do therapy against these. Of course, here's some. Education could be good therapy, community involvement, group therapy, 12-step programs. One of the people we talked to in the environmental issues said nature connection is huge to help people therapeutically. Whether you believe that or not, that's workplace diversity programs. So the question from a systems point of view is how do we connect this all through? How do we go from a societal issue like opioid addiction and draw the trace through? We know a theme is reconciliation. People need therapy. Some of it's this death instinct. David mentioned the hopelessness people have. So as we're thinking later, Brian taught us this is action research we did. Step 1, interview these people. Step 2, look for the themes, what emerged. Have some model here of societal behavior. And now today, we're trying to get to the action part. What do we do with this? And I guess, Brian, the advice is, if you come up with an idea, make sure it connects from top to bottom here. If you skip the human beings, they're very critical in the loop. And if you just address, I suppose like David said, just start putting taxes down on these societal systems and get more funding to them. Whoa, that just eliminated a lot of complexity that's really existing. What is this? No, these were the steps of later on. This afternoon, what we were hoping is that when we try to come up with these novel ideas to connect the dots and think of some ways to take action in Northeast Ohio, maybe we could use an innovation-style thought process. And Tim helped us out with this too at one of the meetings we had. When you're innovating in, I guess you could say in the private sector, or in the public sector, I guess, there's a paradigm that a lot of people try to use for innovation. Plan a goal. I won't read all of them, but those orthodoxies, we got to let go of these orthodoxies. David talked about we need a different style of work. The old style of work isn't going to be the same as the new style. So typically you brainstorm and get rid of those orthodoxies where you can. Think about what the constraints you're under. You just can't come up with any idea. There are constraints. Who do you need to work with? Who are the people in your community, in this case, that are your fortifiers that can help out? And then what skills or services could you offer the group? This is kind of just vanilla innovation, but we were suggesting that perhaps think about these steps as you're coming into the action planning, and it might make a better solution. These will be handed out, I think, later on today, so I don't have to go over that. And then the open space session that we're covering later. I don't think we need to go over that now. This will come up. So that's it. There's our study, and we're excited to get to action. We're all depressed, because we didn't go. But we're ready to go.
And so questions or comments?
Would it be possible for you to just step us through that lovely coloured chart a little bit more?
I love you, yes. I would do that all day. I'm kidding. No one ever asked me to go over those detailed charts.
Show us some more examples of how.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I don't. Patrick, do you mind? I'll use the crypto idea, a little preview. To connect to the layers, one of the brainstorming ideas we all had was to create a cryptocurrency in Northeast Ohio that all the nonprofits could share. And it's popular now, I don't know in other parts, but have you heard of volunteer time off? A lot of companies are giving volunteer time off, and they want you to get integrated with your community. So we're saying use a cryptocurrency to have people, incentivize people to share their talents with nonprofits using a crypto-based system. And you would enter your skills in a database, you'd get so many crypto coins for helping out the most important issues in your community to kind of steady out that funding. So now we look at the chart and we say, would that idea, Patrick's cryptocurrency, is that feasible to help this problem? So the cryptocurrency, I could trace that one through here. Oops. Can we go all the way from the psychological barriers to the top with cryptocurrency? And that's
start at the bottom and work your way up.
and we could start at the bottom and work through. Yeah, I guess either way, but let's say the bottom. So cryptocurrency, why wouldn't people right now volunteer their time off? And one thought here is that maybe it's some of this nostalgic retreat. Maybe they have some resentment, or they just don't want to be aware of their neighbors, so they go back to the old days, dream of the days of industrialization, and they go back in a nostalgic retreat perhaps. So with the cryptocurrency, would that help them to get active in the community? We think that type of, and I don't think the dots here are for the crypto, but that would get them involved more in the community, and that would be therapeutic, that they're getting involved with the cryptocurrency. And then which of these would cryptocurrency help? Let's see. It could help somewhat on reconciliation, but the sustaining change is the idea that we share those amongst all the nonprofits in the region. And then what could it help? We're thinking it could help several of these organization types. In fact, we couldn't imagine a case, we asked all these people during the interview, how do you see yourself related to other issues? And we saw connections between all these nonprofits. For us, on the grid, if there's an opioid epidemic, that's going to impact all the families of all the workers doing the maintenance and service of the grid. So they're going to make mistakes, we're going to have blackouts because they made mistakes, so we got a vested interest in it. Plus, it's killing our workforce in the future. If all these young people are overdosing, who's going to be the next electricity worker to help repair these units and replace them? So I think that cryptocurrency passes the test where it could help all these issues and get them all involved. And then at the top, I think any of the systems they're connected to. So I guess it's just a mechanism to think through from top to bottom. Is the idea, would it really get down to human nature all the way up to the top level system? Patrick, was that a good representation of crypto?
Yeah, well done.
A preview. Spoiler alert.
More to come.
Okay.
Well, another example too would be, so most of these communities right now we're living in are running on fear, right? So people are really jacked up. They are terrified. So to go to Dave's, I don't want to live here anymore. This school system is falling apart. I'm out of here. Where am I going? Well, if we have no control over sprawl and the way we develop these suburban first, second, and third suburban tiers, people head to those. I show my students the Cleveland Magazine. Right, in Cleveland Magazine, they have every year the best voted school district. Out of nowhere, Twinsburg suddenly went from 0 to the best. In Twinsburg, the local factory had been shut down. About 1,000 workers were fired. But all the yuppies and the affluent people were moving in. They demanded an infrastructure. They put the infrastructure in. All the poor people had to move out because their home taxes became more than their mortgages. So what did? They moved over to Ravenna. They moved over to other poor communities. the cycles perpetuate. The school system goes up, but only for the affluent people. And the politicians aren't going to say anything about that, right? And that's an example in my mind of where the psychological level is very important. I think we're living in a time right now where the psychology of people is more important than ever in terms of the policies that are being passed. If I don't want these refugees in my backyard, if I don't want LGBT and transgender people around me, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to move somewhere where that isn't the case, right? Cleveland is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And we were walking around, I think Francis or Philippe had asked me, well, how's the tension? Philippe said. And I said, the tension isn't there because everybody just stays the hell away from each other. I mean, right? They just segregate. And they were amazed yesterday. We came through the back end over to Gordon Park area, right? And it was just dismal poverty, and we crossed over, and then all the hipsters were there. And they were walking around the bay, and hey man, got some great coffee here. Joe's Falafel House, right? And then over here was, you know, just poverty. And those types of lines, and you know, are an issue. So I think in ways the psychology of things is important. And Philippe, I don't want to steal his thunder, but I'll set him up for when he comes down. Philippe's work is all about those mental models. So if you could go back one, Carl. Where are the steps that Tim's... So when Tim had sort of talked to us at our last conference, you know, like sort of processing through the Nexus and stuff, Philippe's work is all about number 3, right? What orthodoxies? What are our mental models? How do we conceptualize the world? And cognitive psych has made massive, you know, advance forward in terms of we are so unaware of our biases, right? We are so unaware of how, at a gut level, our cognitive decision-making takes place as a function of our own pathologies. And then how does that feed in terms of Philippe's work is, well, then what kind of mental models do you walk around, and what type of decision-making are you willing to tolerate or not? Then you add on top of that the disciplinary boundaries in terms of how we're taught to think. And then you have, you know, as you were saying, engineers versus social scientists. You don't even get in the same room and work together without, let alone, you know, getting to the process of actually solving things. So it really is this idea of trying to move up and down. When Peter's work deals a bit with this idea of making, we talked yesterday, you know, Peter said, well, okay, you make a clinical intervention, or as Avi said, you know, so that's clinical level, but then there's the public health level, there's multiple levels of intervention, and how do you simultaneously fire them off so that the cryptocurrency is working in conjunction with, say, what you're doing in LGBT issues and advancing the community's cultural views on things, you know, and connecting those things up. It's new, it's different, and you've got to push people. And I would say probably one of the biggest things is fear. One of the things that I've learned over the years of doing this work is I walk in the room and I'm like, why did they invite me here? I'm a sociologist, you know. I'm in a room with lawyers or auditors or engineers. And the first thing I just say is, I just want to let everybody know, I don't know what's going on. Right? But then we start talking and I go, oh my God, well, in addiction treatment, we did this. And I think that's, you know, like when Carl was saying about, well, how would grid, well, lawyers know how to audit things. We don't do a very good job of mental health and auditing things. We need to learn better how to, you know, as Matt would say, you know, how do we collect data? How do we know what we did works? What are accountability measures that you put on physicians? And only now, for example, with the opioid, are we starting to see accountability on the part of physicians. Where we were talking about, Francis was saying in the UK, that accountability measure already sits. Everything you're prescribing can be seen. And so there's already somebody watching you in terms of antibiotics. So there's already a ceiling put on the capacity of the opioid epidemic that we don't have that type of ceiling because there's not that type of monitoring. But would physicians be open and willing to that type of monitoring? History shows, at least in the States, no. They don't like that kind of monitoring. So I think this sort of runs around the issues. Other questions? We have a few minutes, and I thought we'd take a break and then we'll do the panel. Yeah, Diana.
To go back to the comment about sort of tensions in the city of Cleveland Cleveland, I would argue that there actually are some that exist. I mean, we see that with some of the gentrification of the neighborhoods
Yes.
close to downtown, and even with like the Tamir Rice case with police, there's some
Yeah.
police violence issues that have kind of cropped up in the last couple of years. So I would say that it's kind of reflecting what we're seeing in other parts of the country, but I would say that it's kind of an issue here as well.
Yeah, good pushback. I think that's a very important point, yes. Yeah, Joe.
I'm not going to find the words for this, so bear with me. As you were talking, Brian, as I'm looking at the model, which I love, I absolutely love, I'm going to start using this in a lot of areas. But what's missing is the mystery of personal conversion, personal willingness to be self-reflective and say, this is my bias, I need to change. That, if the individual won't do that, I don't think we're going to have a lot of societal change. And so how do we create an environment where people are willing to be humble and be teachable and change? It's a mystery. I have no solutions.
I love that because yesterday at work I was thinking about this presentation and I'm mentoring a group of people who are interested in becoming facilitators, facilitating change events. And we were going through facilitation and the theory of facilitation, all that. And they said, well, it's just a meeting. You're coming in, people going through change. And I was thinking about this chart and I said, in some of these events, and Larry and I were just in one a week or so ago, this happens a lot, we're in these change events. Some of the people in these businesses, they're never going to go for therapy. They're probably not involved in the community. What Larry and I, perhaps in an event, might challenge someone or take the time to go through that painful struggle, have a crucial conversation, that's probably the most therapy these people are going to get. But Larry and I are not psychologists. We're not group therapy practitioners. Oh my gosh, HR would not be happy if they thought we were practicing group therapy. But Larry and I are dads and we practice group therapy. so we can do some training, but I guess my point is there's a lot of therapy potentials in the workspace. If we could get around some of the red tape of HR, that we could help build a community, a local community. And Larry, I don't mean to speak for you. I think that's what we're trying to do, is get these people, the meeting's important, whatever the business reasons are, but more important, I think, to us is helping those people struggle with that change, and ourselves. So, for what that's worth, that's why I like what you were saying.
Sue, and then go to Kevin and Francis.
It's just interesting that today in our community, for those of you who live in our community, there's a initiative going on, starting, today through the weekend, for folks who either are uninsured or underinsured and remote area medical RAM. So I think people were lining up last night out at our vacant mall. There's no stores there, only a few stores left there anymore, for this to get dental care, vision care, medical care. And so there are a lot of people volunteering in the community to help with this initiative. So, you have to remember, because it goes back to the systems issue, Kent State University is a large system. And so we had, I think at least one member of our staff said, can I take time off? Can I go volunteer next Friday at the mall for this initiative? And she was told, well, if you want to do that, you have to take vacation time because we don't have, our policy doesn't allow you to go volunteer. You have to take vacation time. So it's,
And like Brian is in charge of our volunteering now, getting ideas for volunteering our place, and many of us donate time to volunteer. We just don't know what to do, and it's really hard to decide what to do. We like to help use our talents the best we can to help the community. We don't know. We're just gonna help in a soup kitchen or something. So
are you volunteering right now?
Yes, we are currently volunteer, but it's whatever, comes up. So to Sue's point, if there was a little better orchestration around that, it'd be helpful, Kevin?
A couple of things that we mentioned. Therapy, and you had mentioned you're a father, and I am as well. You are.
We need the therapy.
Right, well, exactly. And therapy is not the classical therapy that, we sit in a room and we talk. I mean, it can be, but I think that we're all have these skill sets to a certain degree. I mean, I'm not a professional therapist, but I think the life lessons that I've learned and through, whether it's parenting or working with other folks. So what I'm saying is we all do some type of therapy, if you will. As far as policies, Dean Stocker was mentioning policy, and that's one of the things that David mentioned earlier. It's one of the things that we touched on the other day. I'm from the IT world, and one of the things I get called into sometimes is the court system. Not often, but for the forensic side of things, or to give talks on that side. Our policies are not keeping up with some of the systems that we're moving with, so I think that's a big hindrance to all of us. David had mentioned, you might have an idea, or Dean Stocker mentioned that, someone wants to volunteer, and it's a fantastic cause, and what they're going to do is fantastic. It's going to help not only the person that wants to volunteer have more self-worth, if you will, but they're going to be providing a service. But yet, our infrastructure does not allow us as a company or a university, whether private or nonprofit, to go and do these things without a bunch of red tape that come into play. So there are a lot of things that hinder what we'd like to do. So again, I don't mean to talk.
Well, no, and I would like to widen your notion of therapy to make clear what I mean when I talk about it in the book as well, and what we're saying. So, for example, when the teenagers started walking out of school for protesting gun violence, our local senator, Sharon Brown, was tweeting like hell. Do it. We are behind you. We're the adults. We don't have the guts to do this right now, but dang it, we're behind you. And all these kids were tweeting, thank you. With my daughters at Chagrin Falls, they're like, don't walk out. So the kids all freaked out, like, we want to walk out. If you walk out, you're going to get a detention. I mean, in that mind, that's a therapeutic intervention by an authority figure who's saying, whether I agree with you or not, we exercise your democracy, act up, do something. You're young. I don't want to kill you with the cynicism that adulthood will bring. Do something. Whether it's right or wrong, that's not the issue. It's the idea of empowering people to participate. And I think, and then in public health, we have lots of models for this, for nudge behavior and ways of really helping people move in healthy directions. Cigarette smoking is a success. I show my students a video, 2 physicians working for the World Health Organization and the local communities eradicated polio in India. 2 physicians working with the community. And so things can be done. Francis, you want to jump in? Then we're going to take a break for our panel.
Kevin has said what I was going to say about
Okay.
how we communicate with people.
Okay. Any last questions?
Well, I just want to say,
Yes,
I
Irene,
think
yes.
everyone is bringing up, very good ideas and topics, but the one thing at the bottom, when you're going around our communities, when you're in our school systems, when you're here, another barrier is just the hopelessness that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And how could we motivate someone who feels so hopeless to, with all the other things that they're bringing in their life, to foster that curiosity, to walk out because that's what they believe in? I don't have that control, and maybe I don't understand the feelings that I'm feeling, but it's that hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to help them get to some of these other places to move through the system up.
And we'll jump in, we'll just go here, but I just want to, like Sue will say, we'll get a faculty council meeting, right? And we'll start whining about the students, about the area and all this, and Sue like, enough! Taking you out at the knees. This is what we teach, this is where we're at, get back out and get the freaking work. And it's like, oh yes, okay, yes. Go ahead, yeah, jump in.
And I'm a counselor here at Kent State ASHTABULA, and also I've worked for years as a social worker working with children and families, and just one parent to opiate addiction, either through death, incarceration, or loss of custody. And I'm kind of sitting here putting myself in the position of maybe a person who's like a single mom trying to raise a child who has autism, who is just struggling to get by. And I think that a lot of people right now are just in survival mode. And that it's hard even to get their basic needs met sometimes. So getting up, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, we need to get beyond getting those basic needs met so that they can move beyond that.
That's very well said. Joan, jump in, or did you? Well, then we're going to take a 10-minute break after this and then come back for our panel. We're doing good on time, by the way.
You're spot on, and I think, Irene, as you were asking that question, and I'm not very good at this, but I'm working on it, is I am really, I teach. Some days I don't know what I do, but I try. But I'm really trying to more deeply get into the world of my students. And I'm realizing fear. If I can understand the psychological barrier for them, and it's fear for a lot of reasons, that's a shift for me. And then my presence, perhaps, maybe, can help inspire the hope. Because I know what I'm working with. I think I've got to start at the bottom of the chart to figure out what's going on first.
Yeah, I like the hope, because to me, if especially someone my age, if I can't express quickly my vision of hope to a young person, we're done. You know, we should all, especially people who have some life experience, should have a beautiful vision of hope to share, like David shared with those ideas today. But it's so difficult.
And speaking of that, the students in the back, they will come over. Jump. I'm coming to you. So here, pause. Go ahead.
I guess I was kind of interested in the model with social technical just being one thing, and I think in this industry, some industries are slow to pick up on technological advancements that could really make a major change. Just like what you're talking about, people being in survival mode. U of M actually, there was this app for food banks, because students obviously always need food, like that's a basic need. So you can see what food banks had something available, and certain students who, you know, if they were facing something, you know, in life and they needed that service, you just hop on the app and say, oh, 5 minutes from here, and then in customer analytics, there's a lot of models to incentivize behavior. City Bike, the rent-a-bike program, they have a leadership board, so the more bikes you rent, they had this big problem where people were dropping off the bikes in certain locations, the big metro, and then these sparser locations, people would take the bikes but never return them because it was a hard thing to like get the bikes back over there. Everyone wanted to drop it off in like Manhattan downtown because it was so convenient. So they actually had a couple programs and incentive leaderboards to get people to walk that extra 5 minutes and drop a bike at a station that needed bikes. But that's where, like, in this field, you can use some of those models for customer behavior to incentivize human or addiction or whatever it is, some kind of merit-based behavior to give people hope, to give them that little nudge. And I feel like in this realm, there's not that, like technology should be social technical because it branches all the fields and it provides a lot of solutions. And at least in what you were talking about, missing the analysis and the data scientists, they're also missing some of the bigger advances in technology and their practical applications in this field. The food banks is one of them, but addiction behavior, having people score their own selves, or little merit-based behaviors. They used to give those coins in AA, and people were proud of those coins.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But, you know, even just apps or, you know, now you can FaceTime a doctor. What if you could FaceTime a sociologist, or, you know, if these public nonprofits could reach out and say, this is our problem, and, you know.
One of the things that's switching is this focus on technology and learning networks, which goes to your point. And that I'm going to challenge you, maybe that might be for the second half of the open space thing to bring up, because I think that is powerful. We are not thinking in the social sciences about the utility of technology for what we do.
But I just want to say I'm excited too, Katie and Marion, don't mean to call it, but they're both employees of NASA. And they're here as the scientists to try and help out with exactly what you're saying, bring some technology to the group, perhaps, and help out with the issue. So
I want, since we're empowering people, students in the back, what do you comment so far before you get the last word before we take a quick break?
So one thing that I've started to notice as these presentations have gone on is this idea of community problems require community action, and that though the specifics of these problems may come down to the individual, the overall falls on the institutions, falls within that community, and no one person is responsible for these problems that have come up, and no one person can change it. So the importance of finding out the basis of a lot of these, finding these institutions and informing the community, I think can bring a lot of long-term improvements along these communities.
Chandler, I know you've got to have one thing to say.
Well, you know me.
Yes.
I'm interested in kids, so I'm sitting here the whole time thinking about how we can change it from the younger ages up. And you know, the paper wrote about changing school systems and so forth. And in my mind, I just see that we have to really get to the younger kids if we're really going to change a community.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I'm probably reading in too much of it, but since I've been thinking so much about this, if anybody's seen the most recent Star Wars movie, it really ends on that note. It's sort of like the adults, Luke, everybody, it's done. But it's the kids and, coming up at the next generation. So I think that's extremely important. I think we don't pay enough attention to what our behavior looks like to the people, who are watching us to see how they're supposed to behave. So. All right, let's take literally only a 10-minute break to get some coffee and use the facilities. And then we'll hurry back up for this. Yes. funny because we pulled the panel and half the room went up to the front. Yeah, over the back. So, as you can see, we're trying to actually run today as a microcosm of this issue of moving across the Nexus. So, started with a very academic introduction, started with Dave at the 2000 level bird's eye view, then moved down to Carl's work to get a more local area, but yet still regional, and then moving down now to the panel. Here the idea then is to start asking two key questions about driving change and connecting, and then use everything that we've got here, go to lunch, let ideas flow, and then Carl and I will introduce, or actually Carl, because he's the expert, how we run through an open space scenario, and then everybody will get to start participating and interacting. I just wanted to quickly introduce everybody without getting too far into detail. So Francis Griffiths. Francis Griffiths, an MD, PhD in the UK, and as a PhD sociologist. Francis and I did a bit of research together, and Francis at University of Warwick. But Francis also spent significant time in the Republic of South Africa doing research as well. I'll let her talk about that. Everybody's met Sue Stalker, our dean. In my mind, Sue is the embodiment of a type of person who is actually doing what we're talking about, making change happen, and she, like Carl, hates compliments, so I'll move on. Petter comes from a computational background and physics background for Chalmers University in Sweden, and is now presently at the University of Amsterdam. Petter was a doctoral student with, David was on his doctoral dissertation committee, and Petter and I had interacted through his brother Anton as well, and then Petter had us out to Venice back in February to talk about modeling and dealing with these same sorts of types of issues, and I said, hey, we're having this meeting, would you like to come? I'm going to make sure you eat good food. And so, but the thing that Petter brings is not just the knowledge of how things have happened in Sweden, but also in Amsterdam and the Netherlands. If anybody remembers, the heroin epidemic of the 70s and needle exchange programs, in a very pragmatic way that the Dutch tend to think through things. Philippe Giovanelli, right? I got it? Thank you. I practiced it because I'm Italian and I better not screw it up. So Philippe is an incredible person in the sense that born in France, went to Canada, studied, back to the UK at Cambridge, then to the States in Illinois. So he's got an incredible international perspective. Philippe is also rare in the sense that he can move from very conceptual, thoughtful, sociological thinking to actually the concrete building of agent-based models and computational models. Petter the same way. And then Matt Butler. Matt is local. Matt went to Kent State, then went on to Case. And Matt is an example of what we're talking about. Matt was in my classes early on and just brilliant. And an example of, I'm serious, and again, all these people hate this, so I'm doing it. I don't care. Matt went on to Case and is an example of, he could have gone anywhere with the intelligence that he has and his abilities, and he came back to the community and has invested in it. You don't know this, Matt, but about 3 or 4 different times when I emailed different people to say, who should I have here, including the dean, your name was at the top of the list. Yeah.
I told someone today you're the smartest person.
Oh, okay. All right. I love you too.
Don't undermine what he just said.
I know, we can't handle the compliment. It's okay. We're all coming from working class backgrounds. We don't like compliments, right? I'm the grandson of immigrant Italian and Slovak coal miner, so it's a big thing to be standing here myself. Dave is, without a doubt, the best lecturer I've ever seen. And students will tell you, when Dave gets passionate, which is always, you will learn. So Dave's a cultural anthropologist. Dave and I met back when I was working at medical school at Neomed, where Diana's now. and was brought in to teach cultural anthropology to medical students. Very, very difficult task. Talk about, trying to get them to think. I remember when I was doing this, I was talking about inequality in Northeastern Ohio, and a student raised his hand, and I said, oh my gosh, what, yes. This question, you said, is it on the test? I said, well, no, it's on the test of life. They're like, okay, and they erase. I don't care about it right now. Pass my boards. So Dave came in and did an incredible job, and then we've had the good fortune that he came up to Kent. And again, Dave is also one of these people who takes this seriously. He moved here, bought a house here, lives here, and has made a commitment to the community as an intellectual, and is really dynamic at it. So now that I've embarrassed everybody thoroughly, we're going to just throw the question out, and I'm going to start with you, Philippe. You talked yesterday about this idea of mental models. Why do you think mental models are so important for driving change? And then what I would also like for the other people in the panel, which I tried to inspire yesterday, which wasn't good because I was going 80 miles an hour in a van with 6 people in it, to Francis's chagrin, to challenge each other on your arguments. So go ahead, Filippo.
All right, well, thank you for the embarrassingly nice introduction. So I feel a bit put on the spot, so I'll try to react to that. So the question Brian is asking is, okay, why mental model? And I'd like to take a few steps to see why we need to get there. So I'd like to tell you about the things I don't want to see or do, why I think it's wrong, and why eventually we end up with that perspective. So the default thing I don't want to see, and I see it a little bit where I'm working now, because we have students from Rockford, Illinois, from South Chicago. I see them being used as guinea pigs from time to time. So the intervention is just rolling out, not much planning, not much, I think it's going to work, so let's see if it works, because let's try on people. Nothing kind of that. So then if you don't want to just take people as guinea pigs, what do? Well, we as modelers or computational scientists can create models, like virtual labs, to figure out what's the right thing to do. But that can be done wrong too. So if I just come in here and I'm like, I'm going to model you, well, I might not know queuings, might not know the people. So then you start to realize, okay, I need to bring in experts in the field, and I need to bring in the community too, to figure out what they actually think is acceptable, what they need. And then that's when you start going into mental models, really. Because if I have 50 people from the community and they all come from different organizations and all that, I'm like, what is their perspective on the situation? If I start to realize that, then I can figure out what's the feasible intervention, essentially. There are many interventions that might work, but if I say, you guys need to do that, and they're like, no, then it doesn't matter what I say, it doesn't get done. So see, it's very important to extract the perspectives people have in the model, which we'll come back to later, I suppose, and look at the synergies and also the differences. There was a point that was made about bias before. How do we figure out where the bias is? Well, you start extracting the perspectives people have, you compare them, you cluster them, you group them, and maybe what separates the groups is where you start talking. Like, this is really what we differ on. We think a different intervention needs to happen because we have that different perspective. And then you have the focus groups, the focus discussion. At least it's educational, if anything, and perhaps you can figure out the synergies from there on. So I don't want to take all the spots.
Well, building off of that, Matt, would you say there is a opioid mindset or mental model that connects with themes, and I know Dave will want to jump in on this in terms of hopelessness or a view or...
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of work with suicide, and I do a lot of work, especially with survivors of suicide loss, as well as overdose survivors and folks that are in active addiction and family members. A theme that keeps popping up here today so far is hope, which is fantastic. I actually do a lot of training of different groups of folks in hope. I'm speaking next Friday down in Trumbull County, giving a workshop on hope. I have it tattooed on my body, so there you go. I think that we get stuck in a mindset of blame and shame and guilt as a community, and the fear plays a role there as well. So what happens is we tend to push away and stratify the folks that we feel addiction looks like. and kind of categorize ourselves as being better than that. So a lot of the solutions that we look at on a local level have to bump up against those mental models. I find that stigma reduction and normalization of things like addiction make a huge difference when you're talking about making an impact. We could have all the money in the world, but if we can't get access to people who need the treatment, it doesn't really matter. And the question of funding, you know, that plays into the mental model question as well a lot too, because you can't make a case for needing money for a thing unless you make a case for why it matters. We still encounter a massive proportion of people in this community that say, just let them all die, there you go, then problem solved. That's stupid, but that happens a lot. In 2018, people are still saying that. I'm really interested to hear your perspectives on harm reduction and things Europe-wise, because lots of us have been pushing things like that are following a harm reduction model, looking at needle exchange, looking at Narcan distribution, looking at things like that and saying, we're losing a lot of people that are gutting generations of people here. And we have to do something to stop that so that we can move forward and talk about reconciliation and things. If people are dead, where's the hope at that point, you know, for that person or their family or their community? I really respect someone who's talked about suicide and addiction as being diseases of despair. And when we talk about despair and lack of hope, there's where a lot of those things come into our community. We have to look at that stuff. We have to look on a broader level. You know, our average person who dies of an opioid overdose tracks pretty closely demographically to our average person who dies by suicide in this community. You're talking about mid-40s white men. And look at lack of industrialization, look at options employment-wise, look at education stuff, look at trauma, generational trauma, look at poverty, and all those things. You're talking about those middle-aged guys. There you go. There's your hope piece and your mental model piece. I could talk literally all day about it.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, yeah, so anybody jump in?
I was going to pick up on what you said about stigma. One of the things I like about working somewhere like South Africa is that it helps me. I can see things there that I can't see in my own place because it's different. It's a bit different. It's not actually all that different. I can see in the South African health system some of the things that they do which they don't intend to do that create stigma. But that's because I'm an outsider there, so it's easier to see. So, for example, if they have, they brought in a colour coding system for the cards that patients bring to the clinic for their appointments, just to make it quicker for the patients to find the right place in the clinic. Well, of course, one of the colour codes was for the HIV patients. So that, you know, you pull your card out of your pocket and everybody knows you've got HIV because of the colour of the code. It's so obvious. But they did it. They did it with the best of intentions. I don't know what you're doing here that's creating more stigma. The other lovely example is the van that used to go to the villages to do the diagnosis of HIV testing. So the people, everybody would be watching, of course, in the village. People would go in the van, and of course it was all completely confidential. But you knew who was HIV positive because they were in the van longer, because they got the counselling afterwards. So it's easy to criticise South Africa. They have similar problems. They have the same problems we have. But I can just see it better. So we just have to. Seeing other places can sometimes help us see what we ourselves are doing to create stigma.
And relative, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, so I think the stigma point is very useful to think about the sort of drug policies in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, there's actually a television show aimed at teenagers and so on, in which some young guys, they try out different drugs. So they sort of really, they go through all the different drugs and then they just sit through the experience and like say what they feel about it. So they do MDMA and they do like all the different drugs. And it's sort of educational show. But when it comes to, and they also show the day after and the effects day after, and where it's maybe not as fun. And when it comes to heroin, they were like, no, we're not going to do this, and they flushed down the toilet. And I think that makes an important point because it's sort of like when you don't, when you're not saying that weed or hash is going to make you, is going to kill you, your credibility for what you say about the drugs that are actually dangerous increase. And so it's the same thing with drug dealers in the Netherlands. They don't sell heroin because they say it's too dangerous. And everything else is super visible and like easy to get hold of. But these normative roles or the normative boundaries are set in very different ways, and the stigma is just very different. And that also comes into account on how the government deal with the policies. So as Brian mentioned, they had like in the Netherlands quite a serious heroin epidemic in the 70s, and they dealt with it in a very different way. And like we've all sort of so far concluded that these are community problems, these are social problems, not medical problems. And so, whereas the sort of war on drugs policies of the U.S. has led to 20% of the world prison population being American, while only 4% of the world population is American, and to the sort of deaths by drugs that we see today, they're clearly not working very well. We know that they're not working very well, but we have positive examples of things that we can do in Portugal, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and so what they've done in the Netherlands is basically is not only needle exchange, but the government gives addicts heroin in a controlled setting. But that is for the small population of people who are not, who do not respond to the sort of social interventions. So the social interventions are the main program. So that's therapy, help with housing, whatever problem you have in your life, they try to support that. And that helps with dealing with almost everyone. And there is a small group of community, a small group that have maybe problematic genetic preconditions and also often mixed with childhood trauma. They do not respond very well to this, and that group they put them on heroin in a controlled and safe environment, and which is shown to be very successful. And I mean, so the response we often get to that is that, well, the U.S. is not the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a very small, very rich, sort of homogeneous country. Well, you can compare it with Sweden. That actually makes a very nice case comparison, because Sweden is very, very similar in almost every respect, except our drug policies. So Sweden and the Netherlands are on opposite sides when it comes in the EU when it comes to drug policy. Sweden has very, very strong norms against everything. Like weed is considered like that heroin. It's not a difference. And so Sweden has, the result is that Sweden has the lowest people have tried any drugs in Europe. It's often, I try to look up the statistics, but it's just that unmeasurably low. So that tells you something. But at the same time, Sweden has 5 times the number of deaths from drugs from the European average, which just goes to show what happens when you have this stigmatizing policies and this when you're pushed out of society. At the same time, Sweden is a very rich country, and so it doesn't become that big of a problem because it's such a small population. I think it's the deaths we have per year is what the U.S. has per day, so about 180 or something. But yeah.
Relative to that, David, so yesterday Joe had the grand rounds the day prior, which we unfortunately got to miss. Was the gentleman running the childhood adversity? Was it right, Francis, or the adverse childhood?
Adverse childhood experiences or events.
Yeah. Okay, and had a list of trauma. What was fascinating about the research is this isn't just trauma and then your life goes on and you didn't deal with that trauma. This was research saying the trauma itself reprograms the neurobiochemical structure of people, and the higher you go up on the scale, the more significant mental health and physical health outcomes you have later in adulthood. And I was wondering, Dave, because we've chatted about this, would you argue or agree that there is also community trauma? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Good idea.
And also a community mindset, which will sort of lead to how soon you've dealt with that kind of mindset.
Yeah, well, there unquestionably is. I was pretty influenced by the fact that we began with David Byrne today. If I may interpret that, he was setting a context. And I would say a context in both historical terms, social terms, cultural terms, and it's simultaneously a local and a global context. He even referred to the decline of the Roman Empire. And so location is always terribly important in anything we think about, and if you're located in a deindustrialized corner of the globe, trauma would be an understatement. And, you know, the idea of thinking creatively about what comes next, there's nothing in place for ordinary people. You know, folks say, be an entrepreneur. Okay, good, I'll start a neurosurgery clinic. In the meanwhile, I don't think an ordinary person could grow pumpkins and sell them any place in this area because they're for sale in gigantic vats at box stores. You know, it's just incredible. There is nothing here to replace what was. And trauma really, not to be too hyperbolic about this, is a bit of an understatement. We're talking about anomie, we're talking about a lost and traumatized population in a world stood on its head. There's an old saying from some decades ago, you know, think globally and act locally. And I can see sort of the significance of complexity theory stepping into the gap between those two domains. I think when we're talking about the local and we're talking about the particular, it must always be with the universal in mind. And universally, if we're talking globally, globalization, of course, means destruction here in the formerly industrialized parts of the world. It's creating misery in the places that the jobs have gone to. And then there's the whole political systems where England leaves the EU, and we have peculiar elections in this country. And David talks about changes in the tax system. Here in this society, we've had now successive generations of Americans who have learned almost from the cradle that taxes are an inherently evil thing, with no notion that taxes can be a wonderful thing, and that the question is, where do they go? So I would just say that socially, economically, culturally, politically, all you have to do is look around and there's the answer to your question. The other thing that we do manufacture in contemporary societies like this one, and we're exceptionally good at it, is fragmentation, isolation, alienation, atomization. So that I think it's generally the norm. Some of us are much more privileged than many, but I think on the whole it's pretty normative to live a life of quiet suffering within these multiple contexts. And I don't think that people who feel connected and respected and cared about are anywhere near as vulnerable to the allure of opiates or anything else. And you can look at the rest of us running, living for the weekends, living for what I call Miller time, expecting no meaning to come from our daily work lives and can't get out of there fast enough and can't run to the mall fast enough or sleep outside in the snow for a new iPhone and all these things that people do. These are all symptoms of a profound and broad and deep malady. And if you want to use trauma to describe that malady, but it's a multi-leveled malady, and we're living with it, and it's always hard to make sense of things in the present, but I think that's the way I heard David talking, and that's the way I sort of see it myself. And no matter what we're doing at a local level or an individual level, I think it's got to be remembered that those are the contexts in which we're operating. Maybe complexity theory can make some of those connections.
Well, I'm going to pass it over to you, Sue, because Petra and Philippe intimated at sort of solutions. So here's our community, here's the mindset, here's the issue. So how, I mean, without getting too far into detail, just you're an optimist in terms of doing things. Well, how did you make that change? For those who don't know, this health science building was built in large measure because Sue sought to make it happen. This campus went from, what's that? I'm sorry. Went from Kent on the corner to an institution that plays importance. And all I know is we've been regional faculty in different areas, and it's hard, right? How do you, to go to Tim and to Kevin's question, what do we do?
I was looking at you earlier and I was thinking, I think when we met, neither one of us had gray hair. So, my background is nursing. I'm actually a graduate of the nursing program on this campus. And so I started out working in the hospitals in maternal child settings, and I would wheel the babies out of the hospital, and I think, I wonder what their house looks like. I wonder what their families look like. I wonder what they're going home to. And so then I became a home health nurse, and I found out what those homes really look like and what those families look like. And so that prompted me to get a master's degree in psychiatric mental health nursing because I wanted to understand kind of the interaction between primarily moms and babies. So I was visiting high risk, primarily teenage moms in our community in Ashtabula County. And one of the things that I think is important, I'll just throw in here as we go through the day-to-day and think about the discussions this afternoon. And as silly as it may sound, I think one of the major issues that we have in Ashtabula is that geographically, we're the largest county in the state. So to get from one end to the other is probably 45 minutes, depending on the weather. And that has created, transportation has created some real challenges in our community. So I actually wanted to take all those babies home with me and couldn't do that any longer. And I think now, as I'm driving around our community, I couldn't be a home health nurse any longer, and it is becoming an issue for the home health nurses because they don't feel safe going into a lot of the homes in our community. I used to walk around, nobody's gonna hurt the home health nurse, and I found out one day that I was in a house and the father of the baby was dead under the porch, and I didn't know he was dead. I was like, "Where's Dad?" Nobody answered. He was under the porch. As we were talking this morning, I started thinking about kind of all the indirect consequences of all the issues that we're dealing with in our community. Physicians, faculty don't want to live in our community. They live in Concord, to the west of us. I mean, that's where everybody lives. Nobody wants to send their kids to the local high schools or local schools. And Irene is in the front row. I heard a story from one of our admissions counselors, and I don't know if it was Irene, but we go out and we talk to children, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one little kid said, and this is like junior high, I'm going to be a drug dealer like my dad. And so, that's kind of the mentality that we have in our community. So, I'm not answering the question. So I got out of home health care. I came to teach nursing here on the campus, and then I moved to the dark side and became an administrator. So my perspective on things has changed a little bit because I work a lot in the community with other people who are in, I'm going to say, people who are in leadership positions notice that I didn't say other leaders. And because I think that's an issue in our community, is there's a real lack of leadership. And that's not just in our community. That's in our country, probably worldwide. But, everybody needs health care, right? So, and quite frankly, the primary program, highest enrollment on our campus is nursing. So we had this vision, because our facilities for the nursing students weren't kind of keeping up to date, to build this building. Well, of course it was, the dean is a nurse, so of course we're gonna do, focus on nursing, but. So we don't get as much money as we used to build buildings on college campuses. The state has cut funding. So even though we're a public institution, we have to act more like a private institution. So I started talking about building this wonderful health and science building, and talked to a group of men in the community, and first of all they said, you don't know a thing about raising money. And I was like, oh, yeah, you don't raise $6 million selling brownies. And so I had to learn how to raise money. Some of the men who operate manufacturing businesses said to me, you need to go get money from the hospitals, because they're gonna be the direct benefit of the nurses and the other allied health programs. After you get money from them, then come back to us, because they realize their employees need health care. So that's how that kind of went. And it was at that time. Now, if I had to go out and do that today, I wouldn't raise the money that we raised at that time. It was just good timing, but. So, we have this wonderful building, but again, we're struggling for enrollment, because I think, particularly kind of the populations that we're talking about today, don't see themselves as going to college. They just don't even aspire to college. And it is, I think, that theme of hopelessness that we see in our community. And I'm going to say again, there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of big thinkers in our community, but it also becomes overwhelming. In some sense it becomes overwhelming, in some sense it's like, oh, you get a group of people together, here we go again, we're going to get together, we're going to talk, and then nothing happens. But then it is also back to the conversation we had earlier about kind of like policies. And so I was on the board of a local hospital, which I recently resigned from, which is a whole other story, but anyhow. It's set up in our community because of the competition. You've got the Cleveland Clinic, and then you've got university hospitals. Will they cooperate? No, they compete. And so we could be helping our community if they would cooperate. Matt works at community counseling. They're doing some great things. I would say in part, it's because they have a person who's the CEO who is a big thinker and is a leader. But you have to get all those people to kind of not worry about the competitive nature, and to come together and to really think about how we think differently. So I'll stop in a minute. The hospital board that I was on, the hospital needs renovation. And so right away, the administrators start talking about, well, what color are we gonna paint the walls, and things like that. And when I would walk into the hospital, I would see people coming out who are obese, who are smoking, who were shuffling. So I'm thinking, okay, those are side effects of some medications, chronically mentally ill. And thinking, again, back to that notion of public health and those kind of issues. And they were getting in public transportation. They weren't going to their Cadillacs to get in and drive home. But that's not the thinking of the administration. They already jumped to what are the rooms going to look like, and people need private rooms, and you know, the bricks and mortar type of discussions, instead of like, how are we going to really improve the health of our community, because they don't think that way. So here, again, it took a community. It really did take a community and the vision for what could be, and the notion that we all need health care. And so that's what kind of built this building.
There are so many good ideas, I just can't help to try to react to a few of them. So on the theme of hopelessness, when you speak to people in the community and you try to, again, look at the mental models, it shows up in the mental models. So it shows up because the mental models are very much about all of the problems that exist, but if any solution could have existed, it's not mentioned. There really is a big focus on what locks up, what creates the inertia, if you will. But if all you look at is the set of problems and you ignore all of the natural levers that might have been there, then you can't find an intervention, you can't find a thing to do because you're so focused on that hopeless feeling. So I think it's important when you have these discussions to move from the really like problem-oriented to the solution-focused, and that came in through your discussion too. And even came in earlier because what you mentioned about the needle exchange, that was a very solution-focused effort. I think about 20 years ago in the US, that there was maybe Castellani and other people who said, well, the stigma is drug users, injection drug users, the IDUs, they should hide or something, let's not speak about it, you know, big stigma. But then the model that they created actually demonstrated if you do that, if you just let them without help, you're going to have more diseases, you're going to have more mortality, it's going to cost you more. The cost is an argument that people can't ignore at least. So that model is the one that changed policy. So the reason why you have actually the drug needle exchange program in the US or in Vancouver and so on, the insight, that's because a model built in part through the community, if I recall, did show that you have to do that. It was the solution is there.
Yeah, and just jump in. What I want to do is sort of, as we're moving here, is now push them to start interacting with each other and talk over, and then jump out here to questions, and we'll start making this interaction take place, and then go to lunch, and then push it into the open space. So Matt, just jump on
a couple of
each
comments.
other's points.
If you want more information about adverse childhood experiences and that pretty large-scale study that had specific information tying these health outcomes with childhood trauma, look at aces2high.com. There's a lot of data that looks at trauma's impact and its direct tie into health later on. Talking about how this is a health issue, absolutely for sure, but nobody's looking from a public health perspective, or not enough people. Down the road 5, 10, 15 years, the costs in terms of HIV and hepatitis C as a direct result of heroin use are going to be staggering, and we're not putting enough attention into that. And talking about what works and what makes a difference are things like this, where we do get leaders and we do get people that are invested across multiple sectors of our community, and we say, let's figure out a new thing, let's try an innovative approach, let's do something else. Doing the same thing as we've been doing isn't having the impacts that we need to have. One program is not going to fix this, one agency is not going to fix this, neither is one sector. We have to collaborate, we have to work together. And the hope is that through that collaboration and through forming these partnerships and these collaborations, we're able to directly impact things down the road that are the next epidemic. That's the thing, looking down the road and saying, okay, now we have this structure in place, let's use it for more things than just this.
Can I follow on that? Because I wanted to comment about what you said about leadership and the lack of visionary leadership. Well, there might be in the formal leadership sense, but there's an awful lot of leadership going on here. And out in the community, there will be people who are showing leadership, and it may just be maybe the son of a father who is addicted to opiates, and he's just doing things just to try and help his father just manage. That's a form of leadership. So that sense of distributed leadership, I think, is more helpful than the idea that you have leaders that are going to have a strategic vision, because everybody's going to be some sort of leader. You do also need the vision as well and the strategy. But I think recognising everybody's leadership role is really important. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is the impact on health professionals. You mentioned about nurses being frightened to go into places. I think we do need to care for the people who are caring, because that really does get into an incredibly negative cycle if we don't. Again, coming back to my experiences in South Africa, it is well documented that the nurses in clinics in South Africa are very aggressive and very rude to their patients. I really don't think that's just because they're rude, aggressive people. I think it's to do with the fact that they are working in a system where they're actually unable to deliver what they would like to be able to deliver. So they have this tensions that they're dealing with all the time. It's also because a lot of them would have come from families where there have been all the negative experiences that we've talked about, and partly because domestic violence and sexual abuse is very common, but also that there has been strife within the communities. So we do really have to look after the health professionals. We really do, because they're going to help people survive through the crisis.
This is actually impacting every sector. You're absolutely right about the health professionals. We don't get trained to deal with the kind of death and loss that we experience now on a regular basis. But neither do teachers, neither do law enforcement or first responders. You're talking about the nurses. I do a lot of trauma training with police and probation and judges and EMTs and funeral directors and teachers. People in every sector. We need to do a better job of training in self-care and compassion, fatigue and vicarious trauma, and what to do about that to take care of yourself. 10 years ago, we weren't dealing with the kinds of losses. Talking about the mental health and addiction treatment world, which is mostly my world, people that were therapists 10 years ago might go a career without having lost a lot of people to suicide and overdose. It happens every week, every month. People are facing staggering amounts of loss, and training programs need to do a better job of addressing that, absolutely, in every field.
So I'm very interested in the idea of what leadership means and at which stage you look at it. Because on the one hand, you have to identify the intervention, like what do we want to do, and for that, I'm not a big fan of the heavy top-down leadership. So for that part, I like much more the distributed fashion of leadership that Francis said. Because something that you might point out is you need the synergies too. So you need to work across the groups, and it's not by one person saying, we do that you're going to achieve that. You really need to have these discussions. But then once you have identified what we need to do, it's much more of the logistics of let's get it done. And that, I don't know if a leader is what you need, but at least a facilitator just to get the logistics for the implementation, the evaluation. But the identification is much more of a distributed process.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points here that come up. So, for instance, Dave was talking about how to tie together change in the local and the global, and sort of bring a complexity perspective there. And Matt also brought up the sort of question of how we bind the different communities and groups together, and also this question of distributed leadership. And I think that this point is precisely what I think is the sort of central question. As a way of thinking of this sort of comes, we've done quite a bit of research as a part of a larger project that studies sort of how societies change. I don't want to go into all the sort of border complexity models and the stuff that we developed, but what we basically saw in this project was that when the market and market interest drive change, which is what we're seeing in our contemporary society, it can only go in certain directions. It's driven by a focus on technological solutions. It's driven by a focus on micro-reductionist, individualist solutions, and a sort of focus on brain chemicals rather than communities. And that's where that sort of main energy, where the focus tends to go. And so we end up sort of jumping, because every new technology we bring in, we don't have systems for monitoring it. We don't see what impact it actually has on society. We just throw in a solution and then we don't even look what happens. And so we sort of end up jumping from crisis to crisis, going from, in this case, crack crisis to meth crisis to heroin crisis, instead of taking a sort of larger solution. And so to me, these problems become really hard to solve as well, because this is really a system that produces wicked problems to me, because we don't have alignment between actors and leadership, in the sense that we don't have the structures, the institutional structures in the third sector that binds together communities to be aligned to go in the same direction. So sort of institutional leadership, one could perhaps call it. And so to me, this means that we need fundamentally new processes for driving change in society, that we shouldn't only think about what to change, but how to change how we change things. And I think that is, like, for long-term solutions, I think we need to think about that, and processes for monitoring interventions, and going back and forth. Because wicked problems, the thing is that you never know, if you act on the problems, you don't know if your actions will have positive or negative effects, because it ends up in this entangled web of causation that just is really hard to deal with. So you need to be really fast with interventions, fast with seeing what happens, and sort of going back and forth. And so I'm sort of interested in sort of how to build this type of institutional scaffolding structures from the community, because I don't think it can really grow from either the public or the private sector, because they have their interests and they're driven by profit market interest fundamentally. And just to sort of throw in a more positive, good example of that I've been a little bit interesting in Detroit, which I will say is close to here. I guess it's not actually that close to here. Close enough. Seems to be pretty big, driving quite a while yesterday.
They got the real sense yesterday of what the American road trip means.
We went like 5 laps around the Netherlands. But anyway, so in Detroit, there's a project that's called Detroit Soup that I found quite interesting. You might have heard about it. And it's basically a community where you go there every Wednesday, I think it is, and you pay $10 or something entrance, so you get free soup, and then you listen to different presentations of different projects, of innovations and things we can do that people have come up that we can do for the community. And then everyone votes for what is the best idea, what is the best sort of solution, the best innovation. And then the person who gave that presentation gets all the money from the entrance. And it's a very simple, very like basic, sort of small thing, but in some ways it both creates ties, but it also creates a sort of an alternative to the market, right? Because it's something that doesn't go on the value of the artifact, but it goes on the sort of social values that the artifact has. So it connects also to the sort of social entrepreneurship that came up before, but sort of how to create a market for social entrepreneurs.
If we did that here, we'd probably vote on the best soup. Not the best idea.
Don't underestimate your young people. Because what I'm very impressed with here is how close your institution is to the community. I mean, that to me is really impressive. That's so different to how we function in the UK. And you have young people in this institution who will have good ideas. I mean, one of them sitting here at the front. She seems to quite young, has good ideas.
I'm actually 60.
She said she's 60 years old.
Oh, right. That's young. So, with the there's 2 things I want to mention is one is evidence, and the other is about the digital age. There is a lot of evidence out there in the academic literature, in other literatures about what does work, and if there is the capacity maybe it's amongst the students here, to actually look at some of that evidence and learn ways of interpreting that evidence Dave Byrne mentioned one of the ways of doing that. It's the realist approach, where you're actually looking for what works and then working out whether it will work in the context that you're interested in. That actually can provide quite a lot of evidence without you having to reinvent the wheel. And the other thing is to think in terms of the digital. One of the, I don't teach our medical students very much because of the type of job I do, but when I do, I'm just amazed how they're using digital communications and stuff in ways I wouldn't have thought of done. So my consultations as a family physician are now quite different because I've watched the medical students, how they're using the websites and stuff. And, you know, I'm doing all that now with my patients because I've now got the confidence to do it because I've seen medical students do it. So I think we need to learn from the youngsters as to how we can do things a bit differently and use some of the opportunities there.
And I just wanted to build on that real quick. Goes to the cryptocurrency. You know, a lot of times, I'm sure you're going to talk this up, bring it up, but people misunderstand cryptocurrency in the sense that they think it's a currency. It's really an advance in technology in the public aspects of what makes the internet originally so powerful, right? And this capacity to get back to peer-to-peer networking through a way of communicating and identity building that allows people to take back control away from Facebook and all these big companies and really, really build local networks that start to use this technology in innovative ways, to go to what you were talking about earlier about, or even, you know, an online soup kitchen or all these sorts of things. But Matt, go ahead and comment, then we're going to turn to the audience and ask some questions, because believe it or not, we're actually doing really good on time. So we've got about 10 minutes or so before we're going to move over for lunch.
I like what you're talking about regarding technology and the digital age, and I think it's important that we look to technology to solve some of those transportation problems that Dean Stocker was talking about. Regionalization, I think, is powerful and important in terms of looking at things with some of those geographical barriers cut down, and taking these larger scale problems and kind of breaking it down into more local solutions. But it can be a drawback here in Ashtabula County. We have, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, I think we have 27 cities and towns and townships within Ashtabula County. So when we talk about Ashtabula County, you know, you're talking about transportation barriers, but you're also talking about cultural barriers between all of these tiny little geographic entities, some of which have more money, some of which have more poverty, some of which have more social issues because of population distribution. I'm really interested in terms of mental models and in terms of that technology piece, how we can break down some of those geographical, or some of those, I guess, regional barriers that exist within Ashtabula County itself, so that it's not the Saybrookes competing against the Ashtabulas, competing against the Sheffield Townships, competing against everybody else. So we can have more of a regional focus while still looking at local solutions for local problems. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So the point that Francis made was that on the one hand context matters, on the other hand there are more generic solutions each to look at. Now the issue is doing it practically is difficult. Because if I tell people there is evidence, go through it and go find what you need, not everybody has the skill or the time or the...
So that's why it would have to be in an educational institution like this. Yeah.
But we can and we haven't created technology to facilitate that. Because if we say, well, here is what defines us, what's our community, then you could have technology to say, well, these are the models that could work for you. It's not like you have to search the whole thing yourself. So you could make it a lot more searchable, reusable, but we haven't done it yet.
And may I jump on that? And then that's an example where learning from Carl, learning from reliability first, and been interacting, is how many times they'll go, don't you know you can already do this? I'll go, no. No, the software exists, or Corey will say, it's already out there, Brian. Oh, well then I guess I don't have to make it. You know, so it's amazing what somebody could be over here doing. They just take it as regular standard practice for the day at Nassau, for example, and we don't know it exists. But if you're willing to cross over and talk to each other and be in the same room, that geography or proximity allows for that. You know, I think of like the way Apple makes it so everybody has to go to the bathroom, the put the bathroom, so everybody has to pass each other's offices and interact. You know, it's purposely built environment to create innovation. But go ahead and jump in here.
I actually just got back from a summit, and there was this great talk from this magician named Ben Jackson, and it was shifting from passion to purpose. And in his talk, he addressed this very issue. So where we work, it's a lot of smaller entities, and they all have to work together because they have a purpose. And I think when you talk about the 27 townships and how things are distributed, when you say this is our purpose and it's everyone's problem, then everyone wants to solve it. But if they're looking at their communities and they're saying, well, we're not bad off, you know, where our school systems are fine, or when you give the overall county a purpose and everyone is committed to that purpose, and they're not just passionate about, well, I want to make sure our school districts are doing well. That's where that competition comes in. We want to make sure we're the best in this. But when you say, okay, Cleveland Clinic and University Hospital, this is our purpose for the community, that's when people really start to change their outlook and work together and share processes and, you know, have these greater discussions where people come out and say, this is what we're doing here, this is why it's working. Can you implement it there? And I think when you know, you really get the leaders involved in the community, and you all come together and you define a real purpose. Like ours is to preserve the reliability of the bulk electrical system. So that's what we do. And I think that's the problem. You know, a lot of people are passionate about solving little problems, but you have to have a greater purpose that everyone wants to do, that is important to everybody.
And one of the people that we interviewed, and Carl can say more, is Marjorie in Youngstown, Warren. That's what she was doing, is she was going on the issue of domestic violence, going to the physician, going to the leaders in the community, the judges, the lawyers, the physicians, and saying, what is our purpose here? It's not just our job, but what is the community's responsibility and purpose in that zone?
You have to define that bigger purpose so everyone can see this is how we're going to contribute to that. And this is a part of what is important to us, so we're going to work to contribute to this.
So questions? We got a few minutes. Tim and then Joan and then Besh.
Just a comment and then a question. First, I have deep admiration and respect for each of you and what you do. Thank you for what you're doing. And Francis, I think you made an excellent point about taking care of those who take care. So I encourage each of you to do that for yourselves too. I know you didn't intend it, but there's a sense of despair that sort of comes from you. And I know it's probably a consequence of the work that you do every day. So make sure you're taking care of yourselves. We need you. The question, in our work, I work with Carl, so we do a lot of work with resilience. And I've heard a lot of discussion today, and it seems like the focus oftentimes in these circumstances is focusing on the people who fail or struggle in the conditions that they're in. Do you also look at those that are successful? Because the human is an extremely resilient organism. And there are those that are raised and operate in the same environment, same conditions, and they thrive. And maybe we could look at the problem a little differently about how to emulate that success and propagate that. Is that something that you do in your work as well?
I don't, but I agree with you that that's the way to do it. And I think there's quite good evidence that actually is a good approach. Work out what they're doing that's slightly different and that makes them successful.
And I'll add on that. The software that we've been building, Corey's been doing a lot of the programming on, we've been working with policy analysts in the UK, and that's the thing we've been looking at is David Byrne has an excellent example of what you're saying. He said, okay, you've got a poor functioning school, right? We all know it's not doing well. And then you have this affluent, high functioning school, doing wonderful. The idea that you're going to drive that poor functioning school to this affluent functioning school is ridiculous. But is there a school, David says, in that area that's succeeding just a little bit more, that's doing just a little bit better? That's doable. And you can drive, so the software that we've been working on, Corey and Carl, is this idea of can you drive that? Can you take the profile of community, and then we sit down with policy analysts, and then it's amazing, to your point, Tim, they start getting creative rather than negative. they start going, well, we could do this. This could work this way. We could do this because it's within a range of doable.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think also in terms of not just success, but what are success stories that are accomplishable, you know, that have the capacity to be achieved.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's human nature or just that I'm old. We tend to focus more on the negative versus the success. And I think also what happens, and I've seen this in the community and some of the initiatives that I've been involved with, people just get overwhelmed. You know, it's like it's too big. And so instead of focusing on something small or a little success, creating something, people just get overwhelmed and then walk away because they don't know how to do that.
So I'll try to tell you a very short story. So we had a data set of people living with overweight or obesity, and those who did not. And we wanted to figure out why some people ended up in one case and other people ended up in another case. The issue was most of the population is overweight or obese. So the distribution is pretty skewed to start with. If you look at schools around the country, most of them might not be doing too well. So the definition of success is perhaps a little bit shooting for the stars here. So like Brian said, it doesn't have to be that dichotomy of like, this is a great case, this is not. Perhaps we have to be a little more lenient on where we're trying to go. So instead of defining these ones are the success we wish to emulate, perhaps we need to be a bit more grayish. You know, an improvement is better than none. So anything we can emulate that is better is perhaps a good enough start.
And John, who else had their hand up? Abesh, just since he hasn't had said, go for it.
I mean, I like the idea of social entrepreneurship because I'm fortunate enough to see a lot of problems around the world and how those are solved based on social entrepreneurship, either through microfinancing or feminine hygiene issues. There are a variety of social entrepreneurship ideas which are doing very well. For that to succeed, the most important thing is to define the problem. What is the problem we are trying to solve? That's the most important aspect for social entrepreneurship to come. Another thing I want to ask is, not too far from here in Case Western University, appreciative inquiry was devised. So that has been tremendously used to solve some social problems, which I have noticed. I mean, the beauty of that is like amplifying what works rather than what doesn't work and improve upon that. So what's your idea on that?
You want to take a swing at it?
Actually, I do.
Yes.
I don't think I would have anything to contribute, but maybe I do. I'm afraid to use this, so I will speak up.
Oh, okay, good. I wasn't sure.
No. Aside from defining the problem very well and framing it well, you need to frame what success looks like. And success can be on a variety of spheres. One is timeline. I was just thinking, I read a lot. Heroin has been around in this country since the 1900s. This is not a 70s problem, a 90s problem, or a today problem. It's a long problem. It's not going to get solved in 20 years either. Very little of this is a generation. It's long term. So what's your real encompassing for solving the problem that you have defined, and what are the metrics for doing it? Are the metrics community by community, little at a time? Are they region by region? What works in one state, as we saw with a specific kind of HMO healthcare that works great in Hawaii and great in California, does not work here, and it does not work in other places. So what works for you and what solves your problem? So time scale, metrics, checking in periodically, and feeding back often.
One last question.
I think today we kind of
in some of these examples, I see where we're trying to use a unit of measurement to measure success. This one's here, this one's here. What makes that one better than the other? Just to say, what is measuring success? Is it striving to be here, or is it striving to do better than what you had originally? Instead of trying to meet some unrealistic expectation on a large scale, where you're not trying to make really small successes add up to something large at the end of the day, rather than trying to meet a high scale objective.
No, it's an excellent point, and I think they're ready to jump in, but that's like the philosophy of nudge behavior, I think, is to move that, but go ahead.
And that's what makes a difference in addiction treatment, honestly. We can't say, of course, what we want is complete abstinence, awesome sobriety, great, 60 years of recovery-oriented lifestyle. But what we're looking for is nudge behavior. What we're looking for is for you to do better. And you can't sustain that kind of individual level change if you're just looking for, I'll have no urges for the rest of my life, and my life is going to be perfect and awesome and the best thing ever. So you're talking about, absolutely, globally, systematically, and on an individual level, that's absolutely what we need to be shooting for.
Well, all or nothing thinking is very
Of course.
destructive. You see it all the time,
Right.
particularly with younger people who
Yeah.
think they have to have it all, or they have nothing.
Right.
Nothing's ever that black and white.
Better is better, right? And progress is progress. And looking for perfection is not the way to solve this on an individual level or a systemic problem.
And can I add, I think it's very important that we ask the people involved what they think would be better, what they mean by better. So that might be a drug addict. Well, what do they want to get out of recovery? It might not be anything like what we think it is. What do the people in the schools think is going to be better? So we have to ask them, back to the mind models really. Everybody will be thinking something slightly different, and it's amazing how surprised one can be as to what people actually do think of as better or acceptable, or that's where I want to get to. It might be quite different to what we think.
Mary, I'm reminded of when the Haiti crisis happened. There was a book written after, I think, 180 different relief organizations descended on Haiti. And then they talked to the physicians and said, what do you think? We'd all like you to leave. And they were like, what do you mean? Like, we appreciate it, but we're going to have to fix this problem. You can help us when we need it. But it was interesting. Dave, you've been quite quiet. We'll give you the last word.
Time for lunch.
I told you he was brilliant. All right, so lunch, we'll pick up, and we're going to go to what's called the blue and gold room. So it'll be out this building, and across the corridor, and just follow people, and then we'll go in, and lunch will be in there.
Do we come back?
No, and then we're going to hold the open space in there, so take everything you have with you.